In the last section, we spoke about how we're going to create a separate layout component and then use that to house all the different repetitive elements inside of our application. One thing I want to be really clear on is why we're placing this into a separate directory. Remember, whenever we place a React component into the Pages folder, that means that Next.js is going to assume that this is a component that a user should be able to visit inside their browser. And that's definitely not the case for this layout file right here. This is a reusable component, and it's not something that a user should be able to visit on its own. So that's why we are placing it into this separate folder of components. All right, so let's flip over to our editor and start creating this thing. So back inside my code editor, inside my root project directory, I'm going to make a new folder called components. And then inside there, I'm going to make the layout.js file. So this is what's going to eventually house our kind of layout logic, or have some common elements that we want to display across all the different pages of our application. Let's get started by placing some default or boilerplate component stuff inside of here. So I'll say import React from React. I'll then export default, and we're just going to directly export a functional component. I don't expect to need any helper functions or have any component level state in this thing, so we're going to keep it nice and simple. All right, so now we need to think about exactly how this layout component will be used. And there's something really important I want to point out. So as we were just talking about needing this layout component, we had said that, well, right now we definitely want to have a header. And at some point in time, we might want to have a footer as well. When I start to put a footer on here, there's some interesting thing you'll notice here. We've got the header up at the top, and then the footer at the bottom, and the component that we kind of want to be using this layout with is sort of wrapped in the middle. In other words, the campaign list component is being placed inside of the layout component. So rather than creating our layout and then eventually importing that into our campaign list, here's my campaign list. So rather than importing layout inside of here and placing like layout like this and just saying like, oh yeah, this is going to get the header to show up, I don't really want to take this approach. Instead, I want to somehow take this entire campaign index component and get it to show up inside of the layout. So luckily, React has a very great system for doing exactly this. And it's referred to as the child or children system. So essentially, we want to make our layout component and we want to reuse it all over the place. And we want to say that the content inside of the layout is going to be swapped out depending on what page we are visiting. So we're really saying here that campaign list should be a child of layout. Now in practice, this idea of a child is really easy to set up. So let's just write out the code for it, and I think it'll be a lot more clear exactly what's going on. So back inside my code editor, I'm going to go back to that layout.js file. Inside of here, I'm going to return a little bit of JSX that we're going to use as a quick demonstration for right now. So I'm going to place a div. Inside there, I'm going to place an h1, and we're just going to give it the text, I'm a header. And then underneath that, we'll place another h1 that says, I'm a footer. Okay, so we're just going to pretend that this is a header and this is a footer. And now here's where things start to get interesting. Remember that our functional components get called with the props argument. Inside of the return statement right here, I'm going to add in some curly braces and reference props.children, like so. Now I'm not going to say anything about props.children just yet. Let's import this thing into our index.js file and then use it inside there, test that out in the browser, and very quickly I think you'll have a very good idea of what this is. So I'm going to go back to index.js. At the top, I'm going to import that layout file that we just created. So I'll say import layout from up one directory, so // components layout, like so. Now we're going to use this down in our render method. So down here, I'm going to find the render method, and rather than showing this big div inside of here, or actually, excuse me, right above the div, I'm going to add on layout. And then underneath the last div, I'm going to close that tag off with /layout. I'm going to do just a little bit of indentation to fix things up. Okay, so I think you might have a guess as to what's going to happen here, but let's save this, test it out in the browser, and just see what happens. So I'm going to go back to my browser. We get the automatic refresh, and you'll see that now we have I'm the header at the top, I'm a footer at the bottom, and in the middle, we have everything for our campaign list component. So let's now talk about what's really going on. When we place the layout component like this right here, and then add some JSX inside of it, all of this interior JSX right here will get passed to the layout component as a property called, you guessed it, children. So all that interior JSX that we have inside of campaign index gets passed into this thing as props.children. So that allows us to place props.children anywhere inside this component that we want. But in the context of making a layout file or something that needs to show both a header and a footer, obviously it probably makes it the most sense to place it right at the very center and then have our header right above and our footer right below it. So now, every different page component that you and I are going to make is going to have a topmost component of layout. So yeah, all the different pages you and I make, for all the different pages that users are going to visit, we will always first place this layout component. Now it's a little bit annoying to have to place the layout everywhere, I know, it's not the most fun thing in the world, but at the end of the day, it's going to allow us to have one location, which is inside this layout right here, inside this component, where we can customize what our header looks like, what our footer looks like, and basically anything else that we care about. So it's really going to save us a lot of time in the long run. Okay, so I think we've got a better idea of how this layout file works now. Let's pause right here. We're going to come back in the next video and we're going to start working on our actual header that we want to eventually see inside of our application. So quick pause and we'll take care of that in just a second. Now that we've got our layout component put together, we can start working on the actual header for our application. Inside the layout file, the first thing I'm going to do is to delete the H1 that we were using for the footer. Our application does not have a footer, so I'm going to remove that because we just really had it in there for demonstration purposes. So what we really want to do is replace this H1 right here. Now, as before, we don't really want to have to do all the styling for a header manually. It'd be a lot better if we could figure out some component inside of Semantic UI that we can make use of and get all that styling done for us for free. So let's go look at the documentation and see if we can't find something that tells us about what we can do here. Before we look at the documentation, one quick reminder, we essentially are trying to make a nav bar that has our logo on the left and then two buttons over on the right. So that's what we really want to make here. Over at the Semantic UI documentation, on the left-hand side, you will see a section labeled as header, but this is a little bit misleading. This is a component that is used to generate a text header. So if you look at the examples, yeah, you'll see right here like page headers. So it's showing you like big text. So this is not really what we're looking for. To be honest, Semantic UI really buries the documentation for what we're trying to make. Like we're trying to make essentially a navigation bar, and they really bury the documentation for this thing inside the left-hand nav here. So we're going to have to do a little bit of hunting. On the left-hand side, I'm going to find collections and then menu. So this is essentially what we really want to make. We want to make a navigation bar. They call it a menu internally. Even on this page though, the type of nav bar that we're trying to make is still a little bit buried. So I'm going to give you a nice easy way to find this thing. If you scroll down a little bit to the first section right here, you'll eventually see this right-hand box appear. If we click on content and then menu, here we go. So this thing right here, this is what you and I want to make, right? We want to have the big logo on the left-hand side and then two little buttons on the right-hand side. So let's look at the code for this thing and get a sense of how to make it. All right, so we're going to import menu from Semantic UI React. We're then going to place a top-level menu component. Then inside there, we can have these separate little menu.item things. And more importantly, for the right-hand navigation bar, we can make a menu.menu kind of like subsection that has a position of right. And then we can place more components inside that. So this little nested menu.menu thing with a position of right is specifically to get us this right-hand group of buttons over here. So essentially, we're going to end up placing the top menu. We'll place our logo inside that, and then we'll place a menu.menu that's going to have our 2 additional buttons. And for us, those 2 additional buttons are going to take the user to the big list of campaigns we have, and then the form that they can use to create a new individual campaign. All right, so let's give this a shot. Now, looking at this code snippet right here, it definitely looks like there's going to be a lot of markup that you and I are going to have to write. And I think that maybe that would be markup that we should keep out of this layout.js file. It would be really nice if we could keep this layout nice and simple, as opposed to having it eventually grow to be very large in size. So I'm going to make another component inside of my components directory, and this one is going to be intended to be used solely as the header of our application. All right, so I'm going to make a new file inside of components, and I'm going to call this thing header.js. Then inside of here, we'll place some boilerplate for a React component. So again, I'll say import React from React. I'm going to import, let's see, what do we need here? We need menu from semantic UI React. And do we need anything else? I don't think so, according to this example right here. All right, then inside of here, we'll make a functional component and immediately export it. So I will say export default and then place my arrow function. Then I will return, and we're going to place a couple of different things inside here. So I'm going to do my top level menu. I'm going to right away do that kind of subsection for the right-hand side. And remember that we do that by placing a menu.menu with a position of right. So that's going to be the content that goes to the right-hand side of the nav bar. So we'll say menu.menu, and I'll give it a position of right. And then I'll close off the menu.menu. All right, so next up, we can start placing some individual items inside of here. I think that we want these menu.item things, and we're going to make one for every individual little button that we end up needing. Notice how the menu.item has a couple of different properties tied to it. It looks like there's a name, an active thing, some on-click, a couple of different items on here. Let's first start off by just placing the menu.item and not worrying about any of those additional properties. We'll then come back and maybe add them on as required. So back over here, I'll say menu.item. And this should have the text. What are we using here? We're calling this crowd coin. And then we'll place 2 more inside of the right-hand subsection. So I'll say menu.item. And that's supposed to have the text campaigns. And then underneath that, we had said that this should have a little plus button inside of it that a user can click to go and create a new campaign. So traditionally, whenever you want to show a plus like that, you usually use an actual dedicated icon. But just to keep things simple for us, we'll just use a single symbol plus, right? Nice and straightforward. Okay, so this header looks somewhat reasonable right now. I'm going to save this file, and then I'll go back to the layout.js file, and we'll use the header inside of it. So back inside of layout.js, at the top, I'm going to import header from ./header, and it's ./ because that's in the same directory. And then I'll replace this silly h1 that we had previously with the header that you and I just made. Okay, so let's now go test this out in the browser and see how we are doing. All right, so not that bad. We've got the text at the top and the 2 buttons over here at the right-hand side. And there's definitely something that seems a little bit off about our application right now. You'll notice that all the content spans from the very left-hand side of the document to the very right-hand side. And that's definitely not what we probably want our application to be. We probably want to have some like margin or gutter on the left and right-hand side. So I think there's definitely still a little bit of work we have to do here. Let's continue with that in the next video. Our header is looking pretty good, but you'll notice that all of our content spans the entire width of the page. That's something that would be really irritating if one of our users had a very wide screen monitor. So we want to somehow figure out how we can constrain the width of all of our content and make sure that we have some additional white space on the left-hand side and right-hand side. Now this is something that is included in Semantic UI and is very easy to set up. However, the documentation again doesn't make it the easiest thing to discover. So I'm going to point us right in the correct location to find this. Back in the Semantic UI documentation, on the left-hand nav underneath the Elements section, I'll find the container component. The purpose of container is, quite simply, to limit the content inside of it to some maximum width. So this is what we can use to constrain the content in our window and make sure that someone with a widescreen monitor isn't going to see this campaign card right here span from the very left to the very right-hand side. All we have to do to use the container is import this into one of our root components and then place it directly in there and make sure it wraps all the content that we have. So it sounds to me like that is another use case for our layout.js component. Remember, we're essentially saying that this thing is going to be used on all of our different pages. So if we place that container component at some very root level inside of here, all of the content inside of our application should probably be nicely constrained inside that container. So let's try it out. At the top, I'm going to import the container component from Semantic UI React. And then rather than displaying a div in here, I'm going to replace that top level div with a container instead. So now all the real content inside of our application should always be getting constrained in width by that container element. So let's now save this and see how we're doing back in the browser. All right, so that looks much better. I'm going to zoom back out to 100%. So this is probably closer to what you see right now. I think this is looking much better than it was before. However, I am a little bit of a stickler, and I don't really like the fact that our header is really nested right up against that address bar. So just one last quick little change. I want to put in a little bit of custom styling to make sure that there's just a little bit of margin above that thing. To do so, we can add some custom CSS inside of our header component. I'm going to change back over to header.js. I'm going to find the top level menu right here, and then we're going to add in some custom styling to it. To add in custom styling, we can add a style prop, and we'll pass an object into it. Remember that whenever we are using JSX and we want to pass in an object literal, we have to place two sets of curly braces. So the first set on the outside says, hey, we're about to write a JavaScript expression here. And then the second set inside is the actual object literal that we're creating. So I really just want to place some margin top on here. So I'm going to say margin top is 10 pixels, like so. All right, so let's go back over and see how we're doing now. All right, so just a little bit of a standoff there just to make it look a little bit nicer. Well, I don't know about you, but I think this application is definitely coming along and it looks pretty good so far. I know that we're spending a lot of time talking about very much non-Ethereum related stuff, but like I said, I wanted to make an application that you could be really proud about and really show off to other people and say, hey, look, I built this, it looks awesome, and it used Ethereum. So even though it feels like this is very non-Ethereum related content, again, the entire goal here is to make sure you have an awesome final project to show off. And for better or for worse, a large part of making an awesome project does come down to styling. So I think we're doing pretty well here. There is still a couple of things we have to think about. For example, remember we had said that we wanted this button to appear on the right-hand side of the page. So I think we still have a little bit of stuff to think about. Let's take care of that in the next video. There's one last styling change that we have to do on the campaign index component. We want to make sure that the button gets moved over to the right-hand side so that we end up with a type of two-column approach like you see on the mockup. Taking care of this is going to be pretty easy. Back inside of our index.js file that houses the campaign index component, we can find that button inside the render method. Here it is right here. We're going to add on one additional property to it. So we're going to say floated equals right, like so. This sets up a CSS property of float and sets it equal to right. One thing I want to mention here, just to be really clear, the property name is floated. It's not float, it's floated. So let's save this and see what happens. I'll save the file, we'll go back over to the browser, and unfortunately all that really does is move the button over to the right-hand side. To get it to actually appear at the top and form a second column, we can just render the button before the list of campaigns is rendered. In other words, I'm going to take this render campaigns call right here, I'm going to cut it, and I'm going to move it underneath that button component, like so. So now the button is going to be placed first, it's going to be floated off to the right-hand side, and then the campaigns will be rendered. So let's see what this looks like. I'm going to save the file, I'll go back over to the browser, and there we go. So that's definitely what we want here. And again, I think this is looking pretty good. All right, I think that's just about it for this page outside of handling some navigation. So we definitely want to make sure that users are able to navigate from this view page of seeing all these different campaigns to looking at an individual one or creating a campaign of their own. I think that we'll start off first by creating another page that our users can visit, and then we'll figure out how to enable navigation between the two. So let's start adding a new page in the next video. In this video, we're going to start working on a separate page that will enable our users to create new campaigns of their own. So if a user clicks on Create Campaign, or the little plus in the header, I want to take them to a new page where they will be shown a form. They'll enter in the minimum contribution level for the campaign, and then click on Create, and as you might imagine, that will force our campaign factory to create a new instance of a campaign. So let's get started right now. The first thing we need to do is make sure that we have a new page that our users can visit. We can add a new page by creating a new file inside of our pages directory and creating a React component inside of there. You'll notice that inside of our pages directory, we still have that old show.js file laying around from when we had done some testing much earlier. We don't really need this file anymore, so let's delete that show.js file. Okay, that looks good. Before we make a new component to house this form that a user can use to create a new campaign, there's one thing that I want to remind you of very quickly. So we had previously looked at a little diagram that had said that we wanted to have some very distinct URLs available inside of our application. We had said that the root route of our application should show the list of campaigns, and then the next page that we're about to show, which is going to be the form to make a campaign, should be available at campaigns/new. So everything that we've discussed about this pages directory so far has said, oh yeah, create a file inside of here, and next we'll automatically pick it up and create a new route for you to visit. But we haven't really addressed how to make nested routes like the one you see right here. In other words, if we made a new.js file inside of that pages directory, a user could visit it by going directly to just /new. But that's not what we want in this case. I want users to see that form if they go to campaigns/new. To get this kind of nested routing working, we can simply create a new directory inside of the pages folder. Inside of pages, I'm going to make a new folder called campaigns. Then inside of here, we'll make a new file and we'll call this one new.js. So this structure right here will set up the routing structure that you see right here. The fact that we have a folder called campaigns means that Next is going to automatically assume that if a user goes to campaign/new, it will look inside this campaigns folder and find the new file inside there. Essentially, I think it behaves just the way you would expect. I'll be totally honest with you. All right, so inside of here, let's start creating a new React component, and then we'll be able to test out this new page inside the browser. As usual, we'll get started by just putting together a little bit of boilerplate. Now, I think that we're going to eventually end up with a class-based component, so I'm going to import both React and the component base class from React. Then I'll create a new component called campaign new, and I just want to check our name here really quickly and make sure we are consistent. Okay. So I just want to see if we were using singular campaign or plural campaigns back inside of our previous component. So yeah, we're going to do campaign new extends component, and then we'll put just a little bit of markup in here now. So let's do a h1, and we'll just give it the text new campaign, if I can type. There we go. And then let's not forget to export this component at the bottom of the file. So we'll say export default campaign new, like so. All right, so now we can test this out in the browser. I'll flip back over to my application, and then none of our links up here work just yet. So I'm going to manually navigate to campaigns/new, like so. And once I do, we should see the text new campaign appear on the screen. All right, so that's definitely not too bad. So essentially, anytime we want to get a nested route, we're going to make a new folder, place a new component inside that, and that will nest our routing structure. So let's pause here. We'll come back in the next video, and we're going to get started on this form. In the last section, we started working on the campaign new component. Our ultimate goal with this thing is to eventually show a form to the user. Notice that we also want to make sure that we have our header at the top of the screen as well. I think that the first thing we should do is import our layout component and show it inside of this one. That will make sure that our header appears on the screen. Back inside of New.js, I'll go up to the top and we're going to import layout from, and then notice that the path here is going to be a little bit confusing. So we're going to go up 2 directories into components and then get layout.js. So we'll do // components layout, like so. Then we're going to add that layout tag to wrap all the content inside of campaign new. So I'm going to do a little bit of reformatting here. I'm going to first add on a set of parentheses, like so. Do make sure you get the semicolon, if you had one, away from the end of this h1. And then we'll place our layout component around it. All right, let's save this and see how we're doing. If we go back over, that's interesting. So we definitely see the text of our header appear on the screen, but it completely lost its styling. So here's the thing. If you recall, when we had previously wired up CSS inside of our project, we had manually added that link tag to our campaign index component. So if we go down just a little bit down to the render method, yeah, right here. So this is where we had just done a little bit of a hack and thrown the link tag directly in. So I think that we definitely need to move this link tag somewhere else. Because this component is only rendered if a user goes to the root route, this link tag never appears if a user now goes directly to the campaigns/new route. So we need to move it to some location where that link tag will always be loaded up. Fortunately, at this point, we now have one single component that we know is always going to be rendered to the screen, and that is the layout component. So I think that we should move the layout component, or excuse me, the link tag over to that layout. I'm going to copy this thing, or I'm going to cut it, excuse me. I'm going to make sure I save the index.js file, and then I'm going to open up my layout.js file. Then inside of here, I'll paste that link tag directly in. Now, even this seems to be like a little bit of a hack right here, right? Like, why are we just directly copy pasting in a link tag? As you probably very well know, we really want to make sure that all of our link tags are placed into the head tag of our HTML document, as opposed to just appearing randomly somewhere inside of some component. Fortunately, Next.js has a great solution for getting this link tag from this component right here up into the head tag. So we're going to add a little bit of code that's going to take this thing and move it up into the head. Let's add the code first, and then we'll talk about exactly how it's working. Up at the top, we're going to import a little helper from the Next library. We're going to say import head from next/head, like so. This head thing right here is a component. We can use it inside of any other React component. If we place any other tags inside this thing, those child tags will be automatically moved up to the head tag of our HTML document. So in other words, if we wrap the link tag right here with head, everything inside of head will be automatically moved up to the head tag of our HTML document. Let's save this layout.js file and then go refresh our browser, and we should be able to explore our HTML structure in the DevTools and verify that the link is moved successfully. So I'm going to save this. We'll go back over to the browser. I'm going to make sure I refresh the page. Now immediately you'll see our styling appear here, and it definitely looks like the header looks much better than it did before. If we now open up the head tag at the very top inside the Elements pane of my DevTools, we can scroll down a little bit and eventually we'll see the link tag for Semantic UI. Here it is right here. So even though maybe this is not the most appropriate location to place a link tag traditionally, this is at least a component that we know will always be rendered on every page of our application. And so even though it's not the most classic place to set up a link tag, it definitely ends up in the correct location at the end of the day. One thing I want you to be aware of is that we can use this head tag not only for link tags or script tags or other things like that, but we can also use this to add other tags to the head as well, like say meta tags for SEO purposes. All right, so now we've definitely got our CSS appearing on this new campaign page. So let's continue in the next video and continue developing this thing. Let's continue by getting started on the form that is going to allow a user to eventually create a new campaign. Now, if there's been any pattern in the React side of this application so far, it's that we're trying to leverage Semantic UI as much as possible so that we can avoid having to do any manual styling. That same lesson is going to apply to the form that we're going to make right here. So rather than assemble this form and all the styling in it from scratch, we're going to use Semantic UI so that we automatically get a really nice looking form. Let's take a look at some of the documentation to figure out exactly how we use Semantic UI to make a form. On the left-hand nav, I'm going to scroll down a little bit until I find the Collections section, and inside there I'll find Form. So as you might imagine, this has a bunch of different components inside of it that are going to allow us to easily create a really nice looking form. Let's just take a look at one example inside of here to get a sense of what's going on. So I'm going to look at the first example here. Notice the big note right here that says, hey, there are a whole bunch of shorthand things we can make use of if we want to. But let's just take a look at the code for this example and get a sense of what's going on. All right, so as you see, we use a top-level form component. This is not the classic HTML form tag. This is an actual form element from Semantic UI. So you will see it imported here at the top. Then inside that form, we can place a couple of different form.field components. And each of those should wrap an individual label and input. In our case, our form only has one single label and one input. So I think this example right here is really just right up our alley. The other thing to take note of is at the very bottom of the form, we eventually want to place a button tag, and that's going to be used for the actual submit action. All right, I don't think this is that bad, so let's try importing the button and form elements into our component, and then start putting the form together. Back inside of new.js, we'll add our import statement at the top for form and button from Semantic UI React. Then down inside of the component itself, right underneath our H1, we'll place a new instance of the form component. Inside there, we'll place a single form.field. And it's inside this field thing right here that we're going to actually place our label and our input. So I'll do a label, and we're going to label this thing as saying minimum contribution, like so. And then we also want to make sure that we have an input. We're not going to add any additional properties on the input just yet. I hesitated there for just a second. We'll come back to the input in just a second and wire up some additional event handlers and whatnot to it. But first, let's just place that submit button. So we also want to have a button on here. We're going to mark this thing as primary, just like we did previously. Remember that primary on a button gives it that nice kind of blue look that kind of draws the user's eye to it. So we'll say button primary, and I'll give it the text create, because this is going to create a new campaign. At the same time, I think we should also be a little bit more clear as to what this form is for. So instead of the H1 up here, let's add a little bit more reasonable description. I'm going to remove the entire H1 and I'll replace it with an H3 that's a little bit more reasonably sized, and I'll give it the text, create a campaign, like so. All right, so you know the drill. Let's save this thing and see how it's doing in the browser. Back in the browser. All right, that definitely looks just fine. I like it. Of course, we can type stuff in, and if we click the create button right here, the form would attempt to submit itself in a very classic HTML style to our backend server, which has no idea what to do with this form submittal. So we definitely still have to hook up some event handler to the form. We also have to make sure we add some event handler to the text input right here as well, so that we record the input that the user types in. Let's take care of both those tasks in the next video. With our form in place, we can now start to wire up a couple of event handlers, not only around the form submittal, but also to handle the case in which a user starts to input some text. Before we do that, however, there's one quick thing that I want to mention about our form at present. If we look at the form, you'll see that we're labeling this as minimum contribution. Now, maybe we'll just go ahead and assume that our users understand what that means. Maybe they understand that this is going to be the minimum amount of money that people have to donate in order to be a contributor to our campaign. Even if they understand that, however, what we are making not at all clear is whether or not this input right here should be a number in terms of ether or a number in terms of way. So I think we need to address that just a little bit and make sure we kind of annotate this input to make it a little bit more obvious to our users as to whether they are entering a way value or an ether value. To do that, I think that we could probably use an input component provided by Semantic UI that allows us to put a nice little label on the component itself. As usual, we'll do a quick check on the documentation just to make sure you understand how we're going to do this. In the documentation, underneath Elements, I'll find the Input section. Then I'll scroll down to a couple of the examples, and we're going to look for the one that says Labeled. So here it is right here. So notice how we've got this nice looking label on here. I would really like to get this on our component as well. If we look at the code example, all we have to do is use the input component from Semantic UI rather than the normal input tag that we're using right now, and we'll add a label property. The only thing to note is that that will make the label show up on the left-hand side. And since this is a denomination or kind of like units of a number, it should really appear on the right-hand side. If we check out the next example, however, you'll notice that we can add on one other property called label position and set that to right. And that will get everything to appear on the right-hand side. So let's do this quick little fix. Back inside of our campaign new component, I'm going to also import input. Then down here inside of the form field, I'm going to replace that normal input tag with the input component. We'll assign it the label property of way so that everyone understands this is a way value input, and then we'll set the label position to be right, like so. All right, let's do a quick check as usual, just to make sure this is working. And there we go. So now it's really clear to everyone, yeah, this is a way input right here. That's the number we expect. All right, that was a quick little fix. So let's keep going right now and set up a couple of event handlers to make sure that we actually record user input on the input tag that we just added. Remember that whenever we want to handle some user input inside of a React component, there's two things we have to do. We're going to set up a new piece of state to hold that value that the user is entering, and then we're also going to add a change handler, an event handler, on the actual input component itself. So anytime a user types a new character in, we're going to update our state. Whenever we update our state, that causes the component to re-render, and then that new text will appear in the input itself. Let's first get started by initializing our state object up at the top of the component. So we're going to say state equals, and we'll use a minimum contribution. So that's going to be the piece of state that records whatever the user is typing into our input right here. Even though we expect this right here to be a number input, we're going to default this value to be a string, because whenever we're dealing with user input, we always assume we are working with a string here. Now that we've got that, we can set up our event handler on the input tag and also set its value property at the same time as well. I'm going to new line this thing just to give myself a little bit of space, like so. And then we're going to set up first our value property. So this is where we take our state value for minimum contribution and push it back into the component. So we'll say this.state.minimum contribution. And then underneath it, we'll set up our event handler to update that state anytime a user types inside this thing. So we'll say onChange. This will be called with an event object, and we'll call this.setState minimum contribution is now going to be event.target.value. And then I'm going to save this file just so my code will reformat and you can easily see it all on the screen at one time. All right, there we go. So whenever a user types in this thing, it's going to trigger this function and give us the event object. And remember that event object contains the new value. We then update the minimum contribution piece of state with it. That causes the entire component to re-render, and we get that new value shoved into the input. Let's go back over to the browser and test this out again. Now back over here, you might see something that says cannot read blah, blah, blah of null. That's totally fine. We just need to refresh the page. So I'm going to refresh, and there we go. Now there's not going to be any difference in behavior just because we hooked up state. Really what we want to do is make sure that we don't see any error messages appear in our console. So I'm going to type some numbers in, and yep, no error messages. So that means that everything must have been hooked up just fine. All right, so that's definitely working out the way we expect. Let's continue in the next section where we're going to start hooking up our form submittal. And whenever a user submits the form, we'll be sure to attempt to create a new instance of a campaign. So I'll see you in just a minute. Our input is now properly tracking our user's input. We can now set up an event handler on our form tag right here. And whenever a user submits our form, we will attempt to create a new campaign by using our factory contract. Again, this is the fun part. This is where we get to get back into the Ethereum world. So let's get started by first creating an event handler inside of our component right here. So I'm going to add on a new method, and I'm going to call it onSubmit. Now remember, usually we define methods with this method looking syntax right here, but if we use this syntax with an event handler, the value of this inside of that method will not be set correctly unless we do some function binding when we pass in the event handler to our form tag. That's just a long, complicated way of saying that we're going to use a slightly different syntax here, where we say onSubmit equals, and then an arrow function like so. Let's make sure that we take this onSubmit handler and we pass it in to the form tag right here. So we want to watch for the onSubmit event. And whenever that occurs, we want to execute the function this.onSubmit. One thing to keep in mind is that we do not want to place parentheses on this because we're not trying to run this function right now. We want to pass a reference to onSubmit to this component so that it can be executed at some point in the future. So I'm not going to place any parentheses after it. All right, so now inside of the onSubmit handler, this is going to handle a form submittal. And remember, whenever we do a form submittal in the browser is going to attempt to automatically submit the form to our backend server. And that's definitely behavior that we do not want to have. So we're going to take the event object that our event handler right here is automatically called with, and we will call the event.preventDefault function on it. And that's going to keep the browser from attempting to submit the form. All right, so now that we're in this function body, we're now at the point in time where we want to attempt to actually create a new campaign. We can create a new campaign by importing our factory instance that we had defined inside of factory.js inside of our Ethereum directory. Remember that our campaign factory contract, and here it is on the screen, it has a create campaign function. We call create campaign with a minimum contribution, and that will automatically deploy our new campaign for us. But it will force our users to pay for that transaction. which is the exact behavior we want. So let's import this thing into our new.js file, and then we can use that factory instance to create our new campaign. So up at the top, it looks like I already have this line of code here. Let's just retype that really quick. So we're going to say import factory, and notice that we're using lowercase factory because this is an instance of a contract. And we're going to import that from .. Ethereum factory, like so. So now we can make use of that inside the onSubmit handler. Remember, whenever we call a function on a contract, it's always going to be asynchronous in nature. So let's make sure that we annotate this arrow function as being an async function so we can use the await keyword. So now we can say await factory.methods.createCampaign. And we definitely want to pass in our minimum contribution to this function call. Our minimum contribution is available on this.state.minimumContribution. That's the text input that we've been tracking from our users. So we'll say this.state.minimumContribution, like so. This is turning into a really long line of code right here, so I am going to new line that create campaign statement. And then after it, we're going to chain on our .send. You'll recall that in all the tests we've ever written so far up to this point, we have always had to specify our gas value. However, when we're sending transactions from in the browser, we get to take advantage of a feature that is included with MetaMask. MetaMask is going to attempt to automatically calculate the amount of gas we need to run this function. So when we're calling this function right here in the browser, we don't have to specify a gas amount. That's something that we should only have to do when we're running tests on our own. However, we do have to specify the source account for sending this transaction in. So as usual, we will get a list of all of our accounts from Web3 and then use the first account inside that list to send the transaction in. That's going to require that we make use of Web3. So let's not forget to import Web3 into this file as well. Back up at the top, we're going to add on another import statement for Web3. And we're going to get that from, again, we're going up two directories. So .. Ethereum Web3, like so. Then back down inside of onSubmit, we can get a list of our accounts by saying const accounts is await web3.eth.get accounts. And then finally, whenever we call send, we'll say from accounts at 0. So we're just kind of assuming here that the user does in fact have at least one account that we can use to send in the transaction. All right, so let's flip over to the browser now, and we're going to test this out in the next video. Our event handler is all put together, so let's now flip over to the browser and test this code out. Over inside of Chrome, I'm going to make sure that I do a hard refresh on this page. We have imported a couple of different files here, and sometimes the next hot module reload doesn't handle that quite correctly. So I'm going to make sure that entire refresh goes through. Then before we attempt to submit the form, there's one other quick thing that I would like you to check. Up inside of our address bar, I'm going to find the MetaMask plugin and I'm going to open it up. I just want you to make sure that you see a screen like this appear. If you see something that says like enter your password to unlock your account, please make sure that you enter your password and unlock your account. If your account is locked when you try to submit this transaction, you're just going to end up seeing an error message down here. Once your account is unlocked, do also make sure that you've got the Rinkeby test network selected as well. Okay, so let's now test this thing out. I'm going to enter in a minimum contribution of 100, and then I'll click on create. And with any luck, oops, I kind of tabbed away from it. There we go. With any luck, we should see our MetaMask transaction confirmation screen appear right here. Notice that MetaMask has automatically recommended a gas amount for the transaction. Now in this case, I don't want to submit the transaction just yet. Instead, I want to show you some interesting behavior. So I'm going to click on reject right here. And when I do so, you'll notice that we get a big nasty error message in the console. Now there's something else I want to show you as well. I want to try deleting the number in there, and I'm going to replace that number with some basically gibberish input like so. I think you'll agree with me that there's really no way, shape, or form that this could be construed as being a number of any sort. So let's now click on Create Again and see what happens. So when we do that, we get another error message. And it's telling us, hey, something, 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 this has got to be like an integer, a hex string, or something else. Basically, you didn't give us a number. So it definitely appears that although maybe everything is working here correctly, we haven't actually submitted a transaction just yet. Maybe it's working, maybe it's not. We'll figure that part out. But what's much more important is the fact that we appear to have no ability right now to notify our users when they do something wrong. Like, what happens if a user enters in 100.54, something way or something like that? Let's see what happens in this case. Again, we get a nasty error message. So I think that we should really make sure that we communicate our failures in submitting this transaction back to the user so that they understand exactly what's going on with the submittal process. The other thing that I want to make sure that we eventually do is to make sure that when a user actually does submit a transaction, we should show some type of spinner on this form. Something to say to the user, hey, okay, like we're processing this, just hold up for a second, we'll eventually solve this issue, like we'll eventually finish the transaction. So in other words, I think we not only need to address some amount of form validation, but I think we also need some built-in waiting mechanism to show our users. These are both topics that I've been harping on throughout this entire course. Something to say, look, for a usable Ethereum application, we have to tell our users what's going on. Because if we don't do that, they're going to think that our entire application is broken and it's just not working at all. And that's going to make everybody leave our app, which is definitely not what we want at all. So let's start taking care of form validation and making sure we get in some spinners while we're submitting the transaction. And we'll start all that in the next video. In this video, we're going to add in some error handling to our form submittal process. Now, one thing I want to make sure is really clear here is that we're not going to attempt to validate the actual inputs that users are entering into the form. We're not going to check to make sure that they entered a number at all. Instead, we're going to use a very similar technique to what we had done back when we were writing some tests around all these contracts. So back when we were writing tests, you'll recall that we put together many different tests where we had some try-catch statements. We wrapped the actual contract function calls inside of a try, and then we would add the catch to make sure that they had thrown an error. We can use that exact same technique on these two statements right here. So by watching these two lines of code for an error message or for an error to be thrown, we can capture any case in which one of these lines of code will throw an error. We'll then take that error and we'll place it on the form for the user to see. So we don't have to do individual validation of any of these inputs. We can just watch these two lines and they'll handle all the error checking for us. That means our life gets a lot easier. So here's what we're going to do. Just like on our tests, we're going to wrap these two lines of code with a try statement, like so. So there's the try, and then we add on the catch as well, and we make sure we catch that error. If we end up with this error object inside the catch statement, that means that something went wrong during these two lines of code. And we want to probably take that error message and display some message to the user on our actual component. In order to get some content on our component, we can use the state system that's included with React. So let's introduce a new property to our state object. Anytime an error is thrown inside this catch block right here, we'll update our state object, and we can use the subsequent re-render to show the error message on our actual form. So I'm going to add a new property to our state object called error message, and I'm going to default it to be an empty string. Then down inside of our catch statement, if we ever get to this point right here and we have an error message, we can say this.setState error message is err.message, like so. This error variable right here is a thrown error, and it has a bunch of different properties describing exactly what just went wrong. In particular, it has a message property, and this is an actual string that can be safely printed into our component. When I say safely, I'm not saying that this is like a human readable error message or something that we should be happy that our users are seeing. I just mean to say that it is a string that we can safely put into a React component without worrying about it throwing an error for some reason. So now that we've got this state property called error message, we want to make sure that it eventually gets displayed inside of our render method somewhere. Now, just as before, when we made use of semantic UI to get some nice styling, I think that we should look at some semantic UI components and see if there are any components out there that can be used to display a nicely formatted error message for our users to read. So I'm going to go back over to the semantic UI documentation. I'm going to find the collections section, and inside there I'll find message. I'm going to scroll down a little bit, and I think underneath like states or types, maybe variations. Yeah, here we go, variations. I'm going to find the section labeled negative/error. So I don't know about you, but this looks like a great way to display an error message to our users. So let's take a look at the code that is used to generate this message. So we can place the message component, and we can use a message.header and a paragraph tag inside of that to get something that looks like this. Alternatively, we can look at the next example here, which will show us a little bit more compact way of setting up this component. So a more succinct way is to set up the message component and then add the error property and a header property to it. Now this one demonstrates using a list of separate errors here, but we're going to use a slightly different approach. If we go all the way back up to the top of this page and look at the props list, you'll notice that one of the props on here is content. And this is a shorthand prop that allows us to specify the content to show inside the error message itself. So we're going to use a couple of different properties with this message component to get an error to display for our users. So let's flip back over to our code editor and set this thing up. First, I'm going to go up to the top and I'm going to pull in the message component from Semantic UI React. Then I'll go down to the render method and we're going to add this thing right above our button component. So right above it, we'll add on message. We're going to assign the error property to it. The error thing right here is what gets it to display as a nice kind of red looking thing, as opposed to like green or gray or anything like that. We'll add on some header text of oops, just to make sure it's clear that something went wrong. And then our content, which is going to be the actual error text that gets displayed inside there, will be this.state.error message. And then I'll close off the component like so. All right, let's save this and we'll test it out inside the browser. Now, I want you to know that when we test this out, it's not going to work the way we expect. So there's one last little change we need to make to this thing to get it to work the way we expect. But the reason I want us to see the error or see it not work is that this is a very subtle little thing that's going to go wrong. And I am 100% convinced that you're going to run into this issue on your own personal projects as well. So I want you to see the error occur, and I want you to say, oh, okay, this is how we fix it. So let's go back over to our application. As usual, I'm not going to really trust the hot module reload, and I'm just going to reload the entire page. Next, I'm going to try to trigger an error. So I want to make sure that an error occurs here. I'll click on Create, and then on the window that pops up, I'll click on Reject. So when I click on Reject, well, presumably something went wrong, but I definitely did not see an error message here. So this is the gotcha. Whenever you use the error property on a message with Semantic UI, as we're doing right here, the message component is not going to show up by default. So when we use this error property right here, Semantic UI understands, okay, I get it, this component is used for validation logic or showing an error message. And Semantic UI assumes that you're not always going to have an error message. Like, think about it. When a user first comes to our form, we don't want to always by default show them this big red box, right? We don't want to show them a big red box when they first come to the form. Instead, we want to wait for something to go wrong. And when something goes wrong, then we'll show them this message. So to help you with that behavior, Semantic UI requires you to add a error property to the enclosing form or the parent form that we have right here. So if we add on an error prop like so let's add on that error prop and save the file. If we go back over, we'll suddenly see that error message appear. Now in this case, we do have an error message here, and it says, okay, it looks like, user denied transaction signature. So, okay, that definitely works the way we expect. I like that a lot. We'll come back to that in just a second. But first, I want to show you what happens if we refresh the page and go back to the case where we don't have any error message at all. So if we refresh, we're now in the state where there is no error message, but hey, look at that. This little error window is popping up by default. And we definitely don't want that. So instead, we're going to add on a little condition to decide whether or not to supply this little error property. In particular, we'll set the error property equal to the string this.state.error message, like so. Remember, by default, this is an empty string. So when our component first loads up, an empty string will be passed to error. And an empty string is interpreted as being falsy. So error will be set to false, and our message will not appear on the screen. Then later on, if an error does occur and some text gets assigned to error message, that's interpreted as being a truthy value. So error will essentially flip over to be true, and our message will appear. So let's save this now, and we'll test this behavior out inside the browser. So if we go back over, let's do a quick refresh here just to get that error we saw to go away. Now when we do the full refresh right here, you are going to see an error pop up. And in particular, it says invalid prop error of type string supplied to form, expected Boolean. So we'll talk about the source of this error message in just a second, and we'll put in a very easy fix for it. But first, I want you to notice that we do not see the error message by default. But if we now click on create and then click on reject, now that error message pops up exactly as we would hope it would. All right, so now let's come back to this error message down here. So it says that we are passing in a string for the property error, but it was expecting to see a Boolean. And that's not a big deal. So essentially, it's just complaining and saying, hey, look, you passed in a string right here for error. It shouldn't be a string. It should be either true or it should be false, one or the other. But this is JavaScript. We can very easily coerce values between different types. So there's a nice little trick for turning a string like this into its equivalent Boolean value. We can put down two exclamations like this right here. The first exclamation is going to take this value and flip it into the opposite value as its Boolean form. And then the next one you see right here will flip it back. Now I'm sure that's really confusing, so let's just go over to the terminal and I'll give you some quick examples of it. So if we take, say, exclamation truthy value, that gives us back false, and then the second exclamation will turn it into true. So truthy value is a true value, and so if we turn this into a Boolean, I would want it to be true. And that's exactly what these two exclamations do. Likewise, if we did exclamation exclamation empty string, it goes to false. And that's exactly what we want because an empty string is a falsy value. So again, that exclamation exclamation is just a little trick to turn a string into its equivalent Boolean value. All right, so let's now save this and we'll do one final test just to make sure everything works. Okay, so I'm going to do a full refresh again just to reset our component state. And I'll enter in, well, actually I'm not going to enter anything. I'll just click on create and I'll reject it. And so our user gets a really nice error message that tells them exactly why this just failed. Likewise, if we enter in some dummy input in here and click on create, it tells us, again, something went wrong here. Now, this is the case in which I had said, maybe the error message is not plain English, and maybe it doesn't really tell our users directly what happens or what went wrong, but at least this is saying something about the fact that we're not going to process their transaction. So this is not the best thing in the world. It's not the best error message, but it's way, way, way better than showing nothing at all. And I think maybe at the end of the day, our users might be able to figure out see the text invalid number value. Maybe they would eventually figure out oh, okay, I get it. I need to put a number in here, like so. So at the end of the day, like I said, it's just better than nothing. All right, so I think this looks good as far as form validation goes, but there's one last thing I want to work on. I want to make sure that whenever we submit a transaction, we start up some spinner or something like that to tell our users that we're doing a little bit of work. So let's take care of that spinner in the next video. like we said at the end of the last video, we still need to make sure that our users are informed about the submission process. So during that 15 to 30 second waiting period, I want to show our users some element to let them know what's going on. Now, we don't have to show them text or something like that. We don't have to show them some big long information message. All we really need is some little element to let them know, hey, just hold on for a second, we're doing something for you right now. And so I think that could be as simple as a little loading spinner that we place on our button. Fortunately, the Semantic UI library makes it really easy to show a spinner on a button, which is pretty much exactly what we need. So let's look at the documentation around this button tag and see what we can do with it. Back at the documentation, I'll find the elements section, and then I'll go to the button tag documentation. I'm going to scroll down a little bit until the right-hand navigation bar pops up. So here it is right here. Underneath the states section, I'm going to go to loading. And yeah, this is definitely exactly what we need. So we're going to say that whenever a user clicks on that button and starts the transaction submittal process, we should show a little spinner just to say, hey, we're doing it. Give us a minute for this to complete. So let's look at how to do this. Essentially, all we have to do is pass in an additional prop to the button of loading. And once that's in there, the spinner should appear. So I think that sounds pretty easy. Let's give it a shot. Now maybe showing the spinner is easy, but just to clarify, we still need to figure out some way to decide exactly when we want to show the spinner. If we look at our submit function right here, chances are that we're going to want to show a spinner like right before we start accessing Web3 right here. So the instant that a user clicks on this thing, we're going to start running all this code. And as soon as that happens, we probably want to pop that spinner up. And then only after we either throw an error or essentially finish with this entire block of code right here, do we want to remove that spinner. So I think that what we can do here is add an additional property to our state object. We can update that state property as soon as we enter this function. And then as soon as we exit the function, we can then update it again and flip that kind of loading flag over to the reverse of whatever it is. So let's add on a new property to our state object up here. We'll add on a new property called loading, and we'll default it to be false. So by default, we're not doing any loading whatsoever. Then whenever the loading process starts, which is indicated by our submit function right here running, we'll say this.setState loading true. So as soon as the user clicks on that button, we're going to automatically start the spinner up. And then after all this code is completed, so after the transaction is successfully completed on the network, we can then resolve the spinner and we can turn it back off. And we'll do that by saying this.setState loading is false down here at the bottom. So now that we've got this kind of flag to tell us whether or not we are currently submitting a transaction, we can use it on our button tag down at the bottom. So back down on our button, we'll add on a new property of loading, and the value for this flag will be determined by this.state.loading, like so. All right, let's give this a shot. So back over inside of our application, I'm going to do a hard refresh, and then I'll go ahead and click on create. Now the instant I click on create, you'll notice that we get that really nice looking spinner. And then again, I'm not going to go through the entire process of submitting the transaction right now. I'm going to go with reject again. But when I click reject, you'll notice that the button resolves back to its original state. And a user can then attempt to do another submittal here. So if they click create again, the spinner starts back up. Okay, so I think that's pretty much exactly what we want. Now you might be thinking, well, why are we showing the spinner before the user confirms the transaction? Well, I think this really is appropriate, right? As soon as the user clicks on submit, we want to make it 100% clear that they need to go deal with MetaMask. So until you deal with this window right here, I don't want you to be able to submit the form again. I don't want you to be able to click this button multiple times and have multiple confirm windows appear. We definitely don't want that to happen. So I think it's entirely appropriate that the button starts spinning as soon as the notification window appears. Now there's one other quick thing that I want to mention very quickly here about this error handling message we have. You'll notice that when we click submit right here, or we click create, the error message doesn't really go away. So unfortunately, our users might get into a state where they think that they are just perpetually doing something wrong. We can easily fix that by modifying our setState call back inside of our onSubmit function. So right here at the very top, we can say that as soon as a user tries to submit this thing again, we could clear out that error message. So if something goes wrong during the next submission process, they might get a new message and understand like, oh, okay, like this is a new error that I need to deal with. So we can say error message is empty string like so. All right, so let's now test this full flow out. I'm gonna make sure I reject all these pending transactions. I'm gonna close the notification window and refresh the page. So now if I enter in a minimum contribution of 100 and click on create, okay, we get the spinner, the window pops up, and I can click reject. And then it very clearly tells me exactly what went wrong. And then if I click create again, you'll notice that that error message goes away, which is exactly what we want. Because if now something goes wrong again, it can be really clear to the user, oh, something went wrong a second time. All right, so this is feeling pretty good. Cool. Now you might be thinking, yeah, that's it. We handled everything around the form. We're done. Well, not quite. There's still one last little thing that I want to mention. So let's take a quick break right here. We're going to come back in the next video and we're going to talk about one additional little aspect of this form that we're going to address. And I'm sure you're tired of this form, but trust me, this last feature is a really, really good one that we definitely want to have in Ethereum application. So let's talk about what that last piece is in the next video. There's just one last thing that we have to take care of around our form. The one thing we haven't discussed here is what we should do with the user after they make a campaign. Personally, I think that after a user uses this form to make a new campaign, we should then automatically redirect our user back to the root route of our application. If we do that, then after making the new campaign, the user can go back to the root route, see a list of all the campaigns, and see that their new campaign has been created. So this starts to lead us into the topic of navigation with Next.js. Navigation comes built into Next. So Next has its own navigation system that we can make use of. However, it has one big problem associated with it. So I'm first going to tell you what that problem is, and then I'll tell you how we're going to solve the problem. So here's the problem with Next.js's routing system. We've been talking about all the different pages that we were going to have inside of our application. And at this point, we've made the first 2 pages on this table right here. In a little bit, we're going to start working on some other routes. That's going to be the bottom 3 that you see on this table. Notice how these 3 other routes that we had previously discussed had some piece of like wildcard information or some variable or token placed in the URL. The variable is the address of the campaign that the user is trying to look at. So in one case, a user might be trying to look at the campaign with address 8147, and then in another case, they might be trying to look at the campaign with address 123 AEC. So we want this piece of the URL right here to be able to change, but even if it changes, we want to still show the respective page that we have created for it. Now, this little wildcard or this token thing right here is exactly what Next.js does not have support for out of the box. In other words, Next.js cannot be used by default, like right out of the box, for dynamic routing. And that's what we're trying to do right here. So instead, we're going to use a little helper module that helps us set up dynamic routing specifically inside of a Next.js application. I've already pulled up the documentation for this helper module. Here it is right here. So the library we're going to use is called Next Routes. And this has some dynamic routing helpers specifically for Next. If we scroll down the page a little bit, you'll see the installation directions. We're first going to install this as an npm module. We'll then make a new routes.js file inside of our project, and inside of there, we will require the module and then use it to add on some of the different routes that we expect to have inside of our application. So let's install this module right now and then start to set up some of this routing. Back at my terminal, I'm going to install the module with npm install --save next-routes, like so. Now this is going to take a minute to run, so let's pause right here and come back to the next video and start setting up our routing. In the last section, we installed the Next Routes module. Now that we've got this thing installed, we're going to do a little bit of setup around it. The official documentation says that we're supposed to make a routes.js file and then eventually set up a lot of the configuration for our different routes inside there. Then later on in the documentation, it also says that we have to do some setup on our server as well. So rather than just dive directly into this documentation, I want to show you a diagram that's going to give you a better sense of the different files that we're about to create. So the first thing we're going to do is make a routes.js file. This file is going to define the different custom routes inside of our application. And by custom routes, I'm talking about the different routes that have tokens inside their URLs. So these three down here. The original two routes that we have up here have no custom tokens or parameters or anything like that inside the route, so we don't need to define those inside the routes.js file. These two routes right here will be taken care of by the default routing system that is included with Next.js. Besides that routes.js file, we're also going to create a new file called server.js. You see, by default, just making this routes.js file inside of our project directory does absolutely nothing. We have to actually tell Next.js to use that routes file. So the purpose of this server.js file is to manually start up our Next application and specifically tell it to use all the routes that are defined inside of here. Now that's not the only purpose of routes.js. The other thing that routes does is it is going to eventually export a set of navigation helpers that will allow our components to automatically navigate our users around our application. And you'll recall that is exactly at the end of the day what we're trying to do right now. We want to automatically navigate our user from our campaign new component to somewhere else inside of our application. So eventually, after creating this file and doing all this setup, we're then going to use this file inside of some of our different components. And just so you know, even though our current component doesn't need this route stuff set up, that's why we're going through all this setup right now, because the helper that we're going to use to navigate around the page is going to be exported from this file. So that's why we're doing all this setup right now. Okay, so let's make the routes.js file and start to define our different routes. So back inside my code editor, I'm going to make a new file inside of my root project directory called routes.js. Inside of here, we're going to require in the next routes library. So I'll say const routes is required next-routes. Now a couple things to point out here. Notice how I have placed a second set of parentheses after the require statement. If I go back to the official documentation, you'll see that the official documentation over here has that second set of parentheses as well. That means that the require statement right here returns a function. And by placing the set of parentheses right after that, that function will be invoked immediately after we require it into this file. So just make sure you get the second set of parentheses after there. Now eventually, we're going to come back to this file and set up some of the different routes that we want to have inside of our application. But we don't need to create any of those special routes just yet. Remember, we only have to set these routes up for any of the routes that have a custom token inside them, like these three down here. So we're going to eventually set those up, but not just yet. So I don't have to place any other statements inside this file just yet, except for my export statement. So I'm going to say module.exports equals routes, like so. Okay, so that's all we have to do inside the routes.js file, believe it or not. This export statement right here at the bottom is what is going to export some helpers that's going to eventually allow us to automatically navigate users around our application. So this export statement right here is really why we're going through all this setup. Now the next thing we have to do is set up a server.js file. And remember, the purpose of that is to make sure that we can manually boot up our Next application and specifically tell it to use our routes.js file. The code that we have to place inside this server.js file is listed inside the documentation over here as well. So if you're all curious, you can always take a look over here at some of the different lines that we're going to have to write. So we're going to write this first block right here that's going to create a next application. And then we're going to also write this second block, or third block, I guess, down here, because we are not using Express.js inside of our app. So we're going to write this stuff and this stuff. And this basically sets up Next.js and tells it to use all this routing stuff that we are putting together right now. So let's get to it. Back inside of my code editor, I'm going to make a new file inside of my root project directory called server.js. And then inside of here, we're going to write all the code that we just saw a moment ago. So I'm first going to say create server equals require HTTP. And notice we have curly braces around this one. Then we will also require in the next library. I think that, let's see what this snippet also does at the top. Okay, so next we're going to use that next helper right here to create a new app instance. So we will say after that, const app equals next, and we're going to pass a configuration object into this thing. It's going to have a single property of dev. This dev flag right here specifies whether we are running our server in a production or development mode. So for the value, we're going to put process.env.node_env, and we're going to say does not equal production, like so. This tells our application to look at a global environment variable called node environment and look to see if it is set to the string production. If it is, then it means that our application must be running in production mode, and it's going to change the way that Next behaves. Now, immediately after this, we're going to place some of the actual navigation logic that is required. So we're going to say const routes, and we're going to require in that routes file that we just made. So I'll say /routes. And then after that, we're going to start placing some of the other code that looks a little bit more arcane, but trust me, it all is tied to this navigation stuff. So we're going to say const handler equals, routes.getRequest handler, and we're going to pass in the app object. And then finally, we're going to set up the app and tell it to listen to a specific port. So I'll say app.prepare .then, and then we're going to pass a arrow function into this. Inside the arrow function, we'll say create server. We'll pass in the handler that was just created, and we'll tell this thing to listen on port 3000. And then we're going to pass in a callback function to this as well that will be called with an error if one occurs. Inside of here, we'll check to see if an error exists, and if it does, we'll throw the error. And then finally, we'll print out a success message of ready on localhost 3000, like so. Okay, so I know that a lot of the code inside this server.js file looks very mysterious right now. We are going to eventually come back to this file and do a lot more customization to it. So we're going to kind of just gloss over the code in here for right now, because we're going to have a much deeper discussion on this stuff later on when we eventually come back. Now the last thing we have to do is customize our startup script. Inside of our package.json file, whenever we run the command npm run dev, we are currently executing the command next dev. So this command right here assumes that we have absolutely no customization to next inside of our app. In other words, it's going to just start up next, it's going to read from our pages directory, and then try to start showing some content. But we don't want that. We want to customize how next behaves. So rather than having next just run off and do its own thing right here, we're going to instead tell next to run our server.js file right here. So that's going to customize what next does when it starts up, and it's going to allow us to customize our routing solution. So I'm going to change the dev script right here to be node server.js instead. All right, I know that's been a lot of code changes, but the last thing I want to do is test this out at the terminal. So I'm going to flip back over to my terminal, and I'm going to run the command npm run dev. And then when I do so, I should eventually see the message listening on localhost 3000 appear on the screen. There we go. All right, let's restart or refresh inside the browser, excuse me, and just make sure this is still working. So back inside the browser, I'm going to wait for just a second. You'll notice that we're still doing a reload here. It always takes forever to restart the server because it has to rebuild a whole bunch of different files. I'm going to try doing a manual refresh here really quick. Okay, there we go. So it looks like everything is still working. Now to you and me, it looks like basically nothing changed, and I agree with you, this section probably seems a little bit esoteric, but we essentially just substituted in our own custom navigation solution that is going to allow us to have dynamic routes as we start to work on some later aspects of our app. So let's take a break right here. We're going to continue by making use of that new navigation system and make sure that after someone successfully creates a campaign, we then automatically redirect them to somewhere else inside of our app. So quick break, and I'll see you in just a minute. In the last video, we set up the routes.js file. It doesn't look like there's a whole lot going inside of here right now, but eventually we'll use this file to set up all the different dynamic routes that we need inside of our application. What's much more relevant at this point in time is this object that we are exporting from the file. This routes object contains some different helpers that allow us to automatically navigate users around our application, and also helps us generate link tags to display inside of React components as well. Let's now flip over to our campaign's new component and make use of this thing inside of there. So inside of my code editor, I'll find the campaign's new.js file. So this is what we've been working on for the past couple of videos. At the top, we're going to import two separate helpers from that routes file that we were just looking at. So I'm going to import link and router from up two directories routes, like so. This link object right here is a React component that allows us to render anchor tags into our React components and navigate around the application. The router object allows us to programmatically redirect people from one page to another page inside of our app. So this is what we want to use after we create a campaign. So once a user creates a campaign, we're going to automatically redirect them back to the root route of our application. And then the link tag right here will help us set up some navigation if we feel like we want a user to be able to navigate around. In our particular component right now, campaign new, we don't have any actual links that we want to create. So we're not going to actually use this import here. So I am going to delete it. I just wanted you to know that it exists. So we're going to have only the router as an import. Okay, so now let's figure out how we actually use this thing. I'm going to scroll on down to our onSubmit helper. So here it is right here. Here's where we get our list of accounts. And then we call the create campaign function on our contract. So immediately after we successfully create our contract, we then want to redirect our user over to our campaign index page. So immediately after we call that function, I'm going to call router.pushRoute, and I'm going to pass in the route that I want to redirect my user to. So in this case, it's going to be our root route of simply /, like so. So we're going to get our list of accounts. We're going to create our campaign. This line of code is going to take about 15 to 30 seconds or so as we wait for the transaction to be confirmed by the network. And then immediately after that, we'll redirect our user back to the index route. So let's save this. We'll go back over to the browser and make sure that this thing actually works. All right, so I'm going to flip back over. I'm going to make sure I refresh the entire page. I'm then going to set up a new campaign with a minimum contribution of how about 200. And then I'll click on create. Now, just as before, we get our spinner right here to indicate that something's happening. I'll click on submit, and then we're going to wait about those 15 to 30 seconds. And after everything's complete, we should be automatically redirected back to our root route of our application. So now here's that kind of awkward point where we just kind of sit around and wait for a little bit. But while that's going, I do want to mention that right after this, we're going to open up the header, and we're going to use that routes helper to set up our crowd coin and other buttons up here as well. Okay, so notice how it looks like the page automatically refreshed and redirected me back over to the root route of our application. And now, at the very top, or at the very bottom, I forget what order we're doing this in, we'll see that there is definitely a new campaign that has been created. All right, so that was a lot of setup for one very simple interaction. But like I said, setting up all this routing stuff was not only about setting up the ability to have dynamic routes, we also just went through all this stuff so that we could get access to that router object from our routes file. So that's why we went through all this exercise right now. Okay, so I think this is behaving the way we expect at this point in time, and that pretty much closes out our campaign new component at this point. So let's now take a break. We're going to come back in the next video and make sure that we set up all the different links inside of our header as well, so that a user can actually navigate around our application. Now that we've got our routing stuff all set up, we're going to start working on our header, where we need to make sure that a user can click on these different buttons to navigate around our application. So let's open up our header component inside of our header components directory. So here's header.js. At the top, we'll immediately import the link helper from our routes file inside the root project directory. Remember, the link helper is what allows us to create a link tag that a user can use to actually navigate around themselves. So we're going to go up one directory and get the routes file. Again, do keep in mind that we're using our curly braces here because we are pulling off one possible thing that the routes file exports. All right, so let's find our menu tag right here. At present, we're using some menu.item components to show each of those individual cells on the screen. Now here's something that's going to be just a little bit of a pain. All right, I'm going to tell you right now, this is a little bit of a pain. We've been using menu.item inside of here so far. Unfortunately, menu.item and this link tag that we're trying to use, the styles of each of these two components clash with each other, and they end up looking really goofy. So rather than using a menu.item component to wrap these link tags we're going to create, we're instead going to use only a link tag. So we're going to delete the existing menu.item and we're going to replace it with a link tag instead. And we're doing this entirely because the styling between these two components end up conflicting with each other and it looks really goofy. So for our header, or kind of like the logo on the left-hand side, we're going to place an instance of the link tag. Whenever we place a link tag, we have to specify the route that a user should go to if they click on this button. Now this left-hand text over here, or this first link tag that we're placing, is going to be used for our logo on the left-hand side. So we probably want to make sure that if a user clicks on this button right here, they go back to the root route of our application. So I'm going to tell this link tag that if anyone clicks on it, I want them to go to the route /, like so. Then inside of here, we're going to place an anchor tag. Now that might be a little bit surprising because I just said a second ago that the link tag right here creates an anchor tag for us. That's not entirely correct. The link tag right here is actually a generic wrapper component that doesn't add in any HTML of its own. Instead, it wraps its children with a click event handler. So if anyone clicks on any of its children, it's going to automatically navigate the user around the page. So traditionally, we put an anchor tag directly inside this thing, which is what is going to give it that nice kind of underline effect whenever we use a link tag on some plain text. Now I am going to give the anchor tag a class name of item, like so. The class name of item right here is what restores some of our semantic UI styling and is going to get this anchor tag to look really nice. Then inside the anchor tag itself, I'm going to place the text that I want the tag to show. So in this case, I'm going to give it our application name of CrowdCoin. I'll then save this and we'll test it out inside the browser. All right, so back over here, here's our refresh. All right. And so now if I hover over this thing over here, you'll notice that it's got the nice hover effect. And on the bottom left-hand side of my browser, you'll notice it also displays a link of localhost 3000. So if I now click on this, I should basically have nothing happen because we're already at this page. But if I do a right click and open link in new tab, you'll notice that it takes us right back to the root route. Cool, so it looks like that's working correctly. Let's now use this same approach right here for the campaigns and the create campaign button as well. I'm going to delete those two menu items, and then rather than do a bunch of extra typing, I'm just going to copy down the existing link that we just put together. So I'm going to copy this thing, and I'm going to paste it twice inside of the menu.menu. So this first one right here is supposed to be a link to our campaign list. So it's going to have a text of campaigns. And then in this case, it's going to go to the exact same route as the logo on the left-hand side. So yeah, we have two identical links here, but hey, at the end of the day, we really want to make sure that the user is able to navigate back to this root route. So two links is totally fine. However, the last link on here is in fact going to go to a completely different route. If a user clicks on this one, we want to take them to campaigns/new, where they can use that form to make a new campaign. So rather than have an anchor tag that says CrowdCoin on this one, we'll have it just show that little plus, like so. All right, so let's now test this out. We'll wait for the refresh. Looks like the hot module kicked in. So now I should be able to click on the plus to go to our form. Okay, there it is. And I should be able to click back on campaigns to go back to the campaign index. All right, so it looks like everything is working out just fine. So now we can easily navigate around our application by using the header. Let's continue in the next video where we're going to set up our create campaign button, the blue one right here. And we're also going to make sure that we can use this view campaign link to go and look at a particular campaign as well. So quick break and we'll tackle those two pieces of navigation in just a moment. In this video, we're going to work on our navigation elements inside of the campaign index component. So I want to make sure I can click on the blue button over here to go to our form to make a new campaign. And I should also be able to click on view campaign over here to go to a route that looks something like, where is it? This right here. So if I click on view campaign, I want to go to campaigns/ and then the address of that particular campaign. So that's where we're going to eventually set up some new routing rules inside of our routes.js file. All right, so let's get to it. Back inside my code editor, I'm going to open up my pages index.js file. At the top, we're going to import the link helper from our routes.js file. So I will import link from up one directory routes. Now let's take care of the easy navigation element first, which is the blue button that we'll use to go back to that create campaign page. So I'm going to go down to the render method where we previously made the button right here. And then just as before, we're going to place our link tag and an anchor tag. And we're going to wrap our button element that already exists with both the link tag and the anchor tag. So I'm going to say link to a route. And if anyone clicks this, I want to go to campaigns/new, like so. I'm going to close off that link tag. I'm going to indent the button tag one time, and then I'm going to also wrap the button tag with an anchor tag, like so. So in this case, the anchor tag is what's giving us the actual traditional right-click functionality where we can right-click the link and say something like open in new tab or what have you. So let's save this and test it out inside the browser. So I'll flip back over. We get the hot module reload. And now if I hover over this thing, you'll notice that the link at the bottom left-hand side indicates that this is a clickable link that I can say right-click and hit open in new tab. And yep, there's the correct URL. Or I can just go ahead and click it directly and navigate over to that form. So again, the link tag is what gives us the initial navigation functionality. The anchor tag is what allows us to do like the right-click and open in new tab stuff. And then inside the anchor tag, we can place any other element that we want. And in this case, I'm just using a button because that's what makes sense here. Okay, so that looks good. Now let's move on and make sure that this view campaign button right here is clickable as well to navigate to this address. So back inside my code editor, I'm going to scroll up a little bit to find where we had that render campaigns thing. So you'll recall that inside of here, we've got our description. And right now, we're just returning an anchor tag. So I bet you can guess what we're going to do here. We're we're going to make sure that we wrap this anchor tag with a link tag. And the link tag will display the route that we're going to try to navigate the user to. So I'm going to start off by wrapping this thing in a set of parentheses, like so, just to give myself a little bit of space to also add in the link tag. So I'll now put in the link tag, like so. And then I'll make sure that I pass in the route prop to this thing. Remember, route specifies where we are trying to send the user to whenever they click on the wrapped anchor tag. So this time around, we need to dynamically compute the route on the fly, because the route here is going to be different for every different campaign we have. So it needs to be, at the end of the day, something like campaigns / and then the address of the campaign that we're trying to visit. This is the path that we're trying to generate. So for that, we can use an ES6 template string. I'm going to place my backticks. So notice that we've got backticks here, not quotes, not double quotes, not single quotes. We have backticks. And we'll say /campaigns / and then we'll put in the address of the current campaign that we are iterating over. Remember, all this logic that we have right here is being executed one time for every campaign, and the argument to this inner function is the address of that campaign. So we'll say $, curly braces, address, like so. All right, so let's now test this out. If I go back to the browser and wait for the hot module reload, now I can hover over the left-hand side, or the link over here on the left-hand side. And again, if you look at the very bottom left-hand corner of my browser, you'll notice that the URL is updating to be campaigns / and then the address of this particular campaign. So again, it looks like this thing is working out just fine. Now you'll notice that if I click on the link, I get a 404 not found. That's totally fine because we've not yet set up any routing handler for this particular URL. However, if you at least look at the path up here, you'll notice that it says campaigns / and then the address of the actual campaign that we're trying to see. So that's great because it means all we have to do now is make a new component to show for this route and then add a rule to our routes.js file to say that if someone goes to campaigns / anything, send the user to that new component that we're going to make. All right, so let's take a quick pause here and we'll come back in the next video and start creating our new component to show our users a particular campaign. If a user clicks on the View Campaign link, they unfortunately see a 404. We are, however, displaying the correct route up here. So in this video, we're going to start to not only set up the route mapping for this thing, but we're also going to set up a new component to display. Let's first take care of creating the component. Now, one thing that's going to be just a little bit confusing here is the fact that we are going to create this new component to show whenever a user goes to that route inside of our Pages Campaigns directory. Remember, we've been saying all along that if we create a component inside the Pages directory, boom, we get a new path. However, we're not going to rely upon the built-in Next.js Pages system to get this component to show on the screen. Instead, we're going to add a routing rule to our routes.js file. But let's first take care of creating the component and then set up the routing rule. So inside of my campaigns directory, I'm going to make a new file called show.js. And the idea here is that this component is going to show our users details about some particular campaign. Inside of here, we'll put together some boilerplate for a component. So I'll say import React and component from React. We'll then create our campaign, which we'll call campaign show. I'm going to say that extends component. We'll define the render method and have it return right now. How about just an H3 that says campaign show. At the bottom, we'll be sure to export default campaign show as well. Okay, so that's easy enough. Now the hard part is to actually set up our routing rule. Inside of my routes.js file, we're going to find where we had created that routes helper and then immediately exported it. So we're now going to use this routes helper right here to set up a new route and say that if a user ever goes to something that looks like, where's our diagram? Here it is right here. If a user ever goes to campaigns / anything, we want to show that campaign show component. All right, So we're going to say routes.add. So the add function is how we define a new route mapping. The first argument to this is going to be the pattern that we want to look for. So the pattern that you and I want to look for is something like /campaigns/ and then right here is basically like wildcard, right? To indicate a wildcard, we place a colon and then the name of this wildcard property or this kind of variable. This variable is going to eventually get passed into our component so we can actually reference whatever campaign address the user is trying to visit. So I think that because this little wildcard right here is supposed to represent a campaign address, we'll call it simply address, like so. Now, one thing to really take note of here, we've got the colon, and that's specifically what says, hey, this part of the URL is going to be a wildcard or a variable of sorts. Now, the second argument to this function right here is which route inside of our pages directory we want this thing to show whenever someone goes to this. So in other words, the arguments that we're passing to the add function are if a user goes to this route right here, what component do we want to show from our pages directory? So for us, we want to show the component campaigns/show. So I'm going to pass in here /campaigns/show. Cool. All right, so let's test this out inside the browser. We should now be able to click on any of our links over here. And you know what? Let's do a full refresh at this point just to make sure everything kicks in. So I'm going to do a full refresh. We might have to restart the server. We'll see. I should now be able to click on any of these view campaign links over here, and we should see, there we go. So no refresh required. Very fortunate for us. You'll notice that our route is campaigns and then the address, and we have our correct component show up on the screen. So that looks good. Now there's one little gotcha here, okay? One little gotcha that's very important to be aware of. If we go back to our root route over here and then click on create campaign, you'll notice that now that link is completely broken. So we're now going back to the same link to the same component that we just saw a moment ago, even though we are at campaigns/new. So this should be showing us our form to make a new campaign. So it looks like we just broke this route. So essentially what's going on here is the routing library that we are using thinks that the word new right here is a campaign address. Like, look at this thing. It's campaigns/some text. Well, that completely matches the matcher that you and I just created right here. So it's being interpreted as campaigns/new, like so. And that automatically gets redirected over to campaigns show. So by adding in this route mapping, we broke one of our existing ones. Fixing this is going to be really straightforward, however. We're going to add on another route mapping that's just going to fix and specifically say if anyone goes to campaigns/new, then show this component right here. So at present, this rule that we just created is overriding the default Next.js navigation system. So we're just going to add a route mapping for this component right here inside of this navigation system as well, and that'll fix everything up. Now the one thing to be aware of is that we have to add this route mapping before this one that we're adding right here. So it needs to be added before. So I'm going to put a new line in here like so, and then right above it we'll add in this route mapping that's going to fix up the new route. So we're going to say if anyone goes to campaign/new, just go ahead and show campaign/new and don't try to do anything fancy with it. Notice that we don't have a semicolon or anything like that at the end of this line. And again, do make sure that this add statement right here is placed before the other one. All right, so let's try refreshing this again. If I do a hard refresh in the browser, I should see our form reappear on the screen. Very good. So now if we go back to the campaign index, okay, here's the campaign index. If I click on create campaign, yep, we show the form. And if I click on view campaign, we show the campaign show component. Very good. All right, so let's take a break here and we'll continue in the next video. In this section, we're going to start working on our campaign show component. Let's first get started by taking a look at our original mock-up for this page and figure out what it really needs to do. All right, so here's our mock-up. At the top, we definitely want to make sure our header gets put onto the page. Remember that we made that layout component to automatically take care of the header for us. So really, we just need to import our header and show it inside of campaign show, and we should be good to go. On the left-hand side, I want to show some details about this particular campaign. Under that, I want to have a button to go to view all the different requests that are tied to the campaign. And then on the right-hand side, we should have our form that allows people to contribute and become an approver. So let's first get started by placing our layout component that should get our header to appear on there as well. Back inside of my code editor, I'm going to find my campaign show component that we just created, and we'll import layout from up two directories, components, layout, like so. And then I'll place the layout component inside the render method. And remember, we want this layout component to always be the topmost component, or the most root component. So I'm going to make sure that the layout wraps this H3 that we already have in here. So I'm going to place a set of parentheses. I'm going to move the H3 inside that. I'm going to make sure I get rid of the semicolon at the end of that line, and then I'll wrap it with my layout, like so. All right, let's make sure that if we save this and check it out inside the browser, I just want to make sure that we get the header to show up successfully. All right, so back in the browser. All right, definitely looks good. So I'm still at campaign show, but I've got all my navigation buttons to navigate around the application. Now the next thing we have to do is going to be a little bit more challenging than that, to be sure. We want to show some details about a particular campaign. So looking at these particular stats, I want to show the balance, the minimum contribution, the number of pending requests, and the number of contributors we have. Now let's remember how we pull information like this off the contract. We have a bunch of automatically generated get methods because we marked most of our variables as public. However, we don't have one single function to call here. We have like 4 different functions to call. These are all 4 different variables that are tied to our contract, which means we might end up having to make 4 separate function calls just to get the information about this stuff. I think that making 4 separate calls over to our contract is a little bit maybe excessive. So I'm kind of thinking that maybe you and I should create a single helper method on our contract called something like, I don't know, get summary or something like that, that returns a summary of all the important statistics related to an individual campaign. So rather than having to make 4 separate calls to the Ethereum network to get this information, we would only have to make 1 call and then have that one single function return all the information that we care about. So I think we'll take that approach because it's going to allow us to just render our page much faster. Rather than making 4 calls like in a row or 4 calls in parallel, we just make 1 single call and we get all the information that we need. That's definitely going to require a modification to our deployed contract, however. So let's take a pause right here. We're going to come back in the next video and we're going to make a change to our contract to make sure that we have some type of function to call that returns a summary of all these important metrics. So I'll see you in just a second. In the last section, I proposed adding another function to our contract that would allow us to get all this different information all in one function call. Now, of course, we could have done this function call back when we were working on the contract. I knew that we were going to need this ahead of time, but I specifically wanted to run through the process of what we would have to do to make a change to our contract and then redeploy it for our application. So this is something that you might be doing on your own application many times, like updating the contract, redeploying it, and then adjusting your view code appropriately. So let's first get started by updating our contract with a new function to return all these separate details about an individual campaign. Inside my code editor, I'm going to find my Ethereum directory, and then inside there I'll find the campaign.sol file. Now this is an additional function that we're not going to add to Campaign Factory. This is a function that we're going to add to the campaign because we want to get details about one individual campaign. I'm going to scroll on down to the bottom of this function, or excuse me, this contract, and we're going to add on a new function that we're going to call get summary. So this literally is going to return a summary of some very different statistics about our campaign. We definitely want this to be a public function, and it's going to be a view function because we're not changing any data inside of here. We're going to end up returning several different values, but we don't know exactly what their types are just yet. So I'm going to leave this parentheses right here empty until we figure out exactly what we're returning. Then inside the function body, we're going to return a couple of different values. So I'm going to give myself a little bit of space to list them all out. All right, let's go look at our mockup really quick, just to make sure that we get all the different metrics returned appropriately. So we definitely want the balance of the contract. We want the minimum contribution. We want the number of requests. And this right here, it says pending, but just to be clear, this is like the total number of requests, not pending. And then we have the number of contributors who are associated with this contract as well. So let's add these 4 metrics to be returned from our get summary function. So back over here, I want to return my minimum contribution, which you'll recall is stored on the variable minimum contribution. So that's this right here. So let's get down here, minimum contribution. Then we also want our campaign balance, which is available as this.balance. So this right here is a reference to the contract itself. And then obviously balance is the amount of money that the contract has available. We then want the number of pending requests. So that will be requests.length. Remember that all of our requests are stored in an array called requests. We want the number of contributors. So that will be our approvers count variable. Again, you'll recall that we store our approvers inside of a mapping, and mappings can't have lengths associated with them. So we had created that separate variable called approvers count to store the number of contributors we have. And then the last property that I want to get from the summary right here, and we didn't actually display this on the mockup, but I think that I really want to make sure that the address of the manager is available as well. So as the final argument to this, I'm going to also, or the final return value, I'm also going to return the address of the manager too. Okay, so now we need to add our return types to our function right here. So we have a couple of different types here. Let's make sure that we add them all on. And I'm also going to give myself a little bit of space for this statement as well, just so you can see everything on the screen easily. All right, so minimum contribution is definitely going to be a uint. We've got this.balance, which is also a uint. We have request.length, which is a uint. We have an approvers.count, which is a uint. And then finally, we have manager, which is an address. And so that last one will be address, like so. Okay, let's make sure we've got the correct values and return types here. So I've got 1, 2, 3, 4 uints, and then 1 address. And so 1, 2, 3, 4 uints, and then an address. All right, so that looks good. Now there's one other function that we're going to eventually need, and so I think we'll just define it right now. I'm not going to tell you exactly what this is for, but I'm sure you could take a really good guess. So I'm going to define one more function right now just so we don't have to come back and redeploy our contract later. Again, this is for another component that we're going to eventually create. So I'm going to define this as function, and it's going to be called get requests count. And yeah, I bet you can guess what this does now. So this is going to be public, a view, and it's going to return a uint. And then inside of here, we're going to simply return request.length. So again, this is a function that we don't need just yet, but we're going to need it on another component later on. And I figured, hey, let's just define it right now while we are redeploying our contract, rather than have to redeploy it twice. Now, a couple quick things I want to point out here. Please triple check to make sure that you've got returns on both the function declarations. It's not return, it is returns. And then the other thing to remember, and this is something I always fall victim to, technically Solidity is supposed to use tabs or 4 lines or 4 like indentations right here, as opposed to the spaces that I'm using. My editor defaults to 2 spaces, so by default, whenever I write code in Solidity, I usually have to go back and fix it. So if we want to be like 100% stylistic here, we should really make sure we've got like 1 full tab or 4 spaces. for every indentation level. Okay, so these changes look good. We've now got get summary and get request count. Let's now deploy this new contract. Well, we're going to first compile it and then deploy it. And then we'll be able to take the deployed address and put that back into our application as the new campaign factory. So just to be clear, when we redeploy this contract, we're going to essentially blow away or just completely forget the existing campaign factory. We're just going to leave it in the dust and not worry about it anymore. So we're going to redeploy the campaign factory, and then that is going to be the new version of campaign factory that we care about. In the development flow, we're going to freely just redeploy campaign factory as much as we wish. But in theory, once we actually deploy our application to the whole wide world, we don't want to be redeploying campaign factory all the time. We really just want to have one canonical instance that we're always going to make use of. We'll talk later on about some strategies of how to deploy your application and then come back and make changes to the deployed contracts, but we'll take care of that a little bit later on. All right, so let's now redeploy our application. We're going to make sure that we grab that address and put it back into our factory.js file. Because remember, this right here needs to be the address of our most recently deployed campaign factory. All right, so I'm going to flip on over to my terminal. Let's kill our server for right now, just so we're only doing like one thing at a time. I'm going to change into my Ethereum directory. Now let's check to see which scripts we had created. I don't think we created any scripts around this stuff, so we have to manually do our compile by calling that compile.js file, and then we're going to run the deploy.js file to then deploy the contract. So inside the Ethereum directory, I'm going to make sure that I've got compile and deploy inside of here. So I'll run node compile.js. That's going to delete our existing build folder and recompile and rewrite our contracts. And it's going to take a couple of seconds to do. Okay, so that looks good. And then we're going to run our deploy script with node deploy.js. And that's going to kick off our actual deployment process. So we should see, okay, attempting to deploy from blah, blah, blah. Now, of course, this is going to take about 30 seconds or so. So let's pause right now and continue in the next video. We're going to make sure that the deployment went through, and we're going to make sure that we save that address. So quick pause, and I'll see you in just a minute. In the last section, we redeployed our campaign factory contract. Note that we only changed code inside of our campaign, but we wanted to make sure that we were no longer using any old versions of our campaign. So we just decided to redeploy both contracts. So we're now going to be working with a completely new instance of the factory. And this new factory will have absolutely no campaigns associated with it. Let's make sure that we do update the address of our new factory. So here's our contract was deployed to, here's the address. I'm going to copy this thing, and we're going to make sure that we update our factory.js file to reflect the new root address for our factory. So back inside my code editor, I'm going to find my Ethereum factory.js file, and I'm going to replace the existing address in here with the new one that we just deployed to. So here's the new address. This is the one that we actually care about now. I'll then save this file, and let's restart our server and make sure that we can still work with this factory inside of our project. So back over at the terminal, to restart my server, I'm going to change back to my Kickstart directory, and then inside of here, we'll run npm run dev, like so. Now, every time that we add an additional library to our project, it takes slightly longer for our project to actually boot back up. So it might take a couple seconds for everything here to get processed and eventually get some content on the screen. So I'm just going to give it a second to kind of warm up. I'm going to flip back over to my application. Now you might still see some of your old campaigns on the screen. Do make sure that you refresh the page entirely. So I'm going to do a hard reload here back at localhost 3000. And when I do so, I should see an empty list of campaigns appear because we now have a completely new factory with absolutely no campaigns tied to it whatsoever. Of course, we need to have at least one campaign to work with inside of our contract so we can actually develop the show page. So let's go back to our create campaign form, and I'll give it just a second to load up. There we go. And we'll create a new campaign instance. I'll enter in my minimum contribution of 100, and I'll click create. And then of course, we'll wait for the actual transaction to be processed. Okay, so while that's going, let's flip back over to our code editor and we're going to start working on the campaign show component. All right, I'm going to first pull up the campaign show component itself. So here it is right here. So inside this thing, we now want to somehow get a handle on the campaign that we're trying to look at and somehow call that get summary function on it that we just added 2 seconds ago. So remember, anytime that we want to fetch some data about a given campaign or anything inside of one of these page components, we're going to define that getInitialProps method. That function gets called automatically before our campaign gets rendered or before our component is rendered to the screen. We already defined this function one time back inside of our index.js file. So here's the index.js file. Here's where we had defined getInitialProps. We fetched some initial information and then returned that as an object, and we then got access to it on our props object inside the component. So we're now going to do the exact same thing inside of our campaign show component as well. So back over here, at the top of the component, I'll define static async get initial props. Now there is going to be one distinct difference between the code that we had written previously inside of getInitialProps and what we have to do now. So this time around, we are trying to show information about one very particular campaign on the screen. And the campaign that we actually care about is going to have its address in the URL bar or in the address bar of our browser. Now remember, we just went through all of that rigmarole and all that complexity inside the routes.js file to set up the ability to capture that token inside the URL. So our routes file right here is going to parse the URL and it's going to look for that wildcard, which it's going to call the address property or the address parameter, because we specifically called this thing address right here. So because we did all this route stuff right here, our getInitialProps function right here is going to be called with a props object of its own. So this is a separate props object than the one that ends up inside of our actual component instance. This props object has a property called query. And one property on this query thing right here is that token out of the URL that we asked our routing library for. And it's available as address, like so. So props.query.address, this thing right here is the actual address of the campaign that we're trying to show to our user on this page or in this component. Just to make sure that this thing is working the way we expect, let's add a console log for it right here and just make sure that, hey, can we actually see the address of the component or the campaign that we care about? So I'm just going to console log it and let's try to test this out in the browser. So I'm going to go back over to the browser. You'll notice that we've now got the campaign that we just created on the screen. I'll click on View Campaign, and we're going to give it just a minute to finish building that page. Okay, my mistake. We just added in that console log, and we actually have to return an object from that thing. So let's make sure that from getInitialProps, we at least return an empty object. And that's just to get that function to work the way that next expects. So now if we flip back over and wait for the reload, all right, there we go. And so now, okay, you're not quite seeing the console log on the screen just yet. There's some very particular reasons for this, but basically remember all this Next.js stuff is all about server-side rendering. If I go over to my terminal, you will see the console log over here. To get the console log in the browser, we can actually go to any other page and then navigate back to this one right here. So if I now go back to View Campaign, you'll see that address appear right here as the console log. Again, we didn't initially see it inside the console right here, just because of the way all this server-side rendering stuff works. We'll talk more about when getInitialProps actually gets executed inside the browser later on, but for right now, we should at least be able to see the address inside the browser. And it looks like we are. So this is the address of the actual campaign instance that we're trying to read some information about. So now that we have this address right here, let's write some code in the next section to attempt to actually get access to the campaign that exists there and call the getSummary function on it, and then show that information inside the component. So quick break, and I'll see you in just a minute. In the last video, we were able to successfully log out the address of the campaign that the user is trying to view. So we now need to create a new instance of a contract by using the Web3 library. We need to plug our address into that, and then we could directly get information off of our contract. Now we've already gone through this process more or less one time inside of our Ethereum directory over here. So inside the Ethereum folder, I'm going to open up the factory.js file. So this right here is essentially exactly what we want to do for our campaign inside that getInitialProps function. I think that we should create another file inside of our Ethereum directory to pretty much do the exact same thing that we're doing right here. So if any other file or any other component needs to get access to a campaign, we can reuse this kind of contract setup code rather than having to write all this again and again directly inside of our getInitialProps function. So inside my Ethereum directory, I'm going to make a new file and I'm going to call it campaign.js. Then inside of here, I'm going to import Web3, and this is going to be our instance of Web3 from the same directory. So /Web3, and I'll also import our campaign JSON file from the build directory up here. Because remember, anytime we make a contract, we need to get the interface or the ABI of the contract. So I'm going to import from build campaign.json, like so. If we go back over to the factory.js file, you'll notice that we create the instance and then we export that instance. And the instance itself had hard-coded onto it the address of our campaign factory. Now for our campaign file, things are just a little bit different. Because remember, in this case, like this file over here, when we are going to eventually use this thing inside of campaign show, we want to be able to dynamically specify the address of this deployed contract. So we don't know ahead of time what the address is. So we cannot just write out some hard-coded address like we did inside of our factory file. So rather than taking this approach right here, where we create a contract and export it, I think that instead we should create a function. That function should receive an address, use the address to create a new campaign, or excuse me, a new contract like this right here, and then return that from the function. So eventually inside of our show file over here, we can import in this campaign.js file and call the function that we export from it with this address. And that should return back to us an instance of our campaign contract. Now, this is another great time where I think the code that we need to write is going to be a lot more obvious than how I can describe it. So let's write out the code, and I think it'll be a little bit more clear exactly how we're going to approach this. So inside my campaign.js file, I'm going to export default an arrow function. So we're going to say that this thing gets called with an address, and then inside the function, we're going to create an instance of a campaign and return it. And that instance will point at this address right here. All right, so inside of here, we're going to say return new web3.f.contract. As usual, the first argument will be the interface from our built campaign. So we'll say json.parse campaign.interface. And then the second argument will be the address that gets passed into this function. Because remember, we're not going to have just one particular address here for a campaign. We're going to have many different addresses over time as a user visits different addresses or different pages inside of our application. So I'm going to pass an address as the second argument. All right, when I save this file, my code here is going to jump just a little bit because my code formatter is going to put it all on one line. So that's basically what it's going to end up looking like for me. But if I were you, if you're not using a code editor or a code formatter, I would recommend leaving this as 2 lines just to increase the legibility. But of course, it's always up to you. All right, so now that we have this function right here, we can import this into our campaign show component and then pass in our address that is coming from the URL into this function right here, and we'll get back our nice contract that we can then ask some questions about to learn about some details of the campaign. So I'm going to go back over to campaign show, and we're going to import that campaign file into here. So I'm going to import campaign, and we're going to give this thing a capital C. Technically, we're not working with a constructor function or anything like that. So, it's not the best to label this with a capital C. I would kind of like to label it with a lowercase c because it's really just a normal function that we're going to call without the new keyword. However, I really expect that we're going to want to have a campaign variable somewhere else inside this file. So I'm going to use a capital C here just to kind of give the implication that, hey, this is a function that generates a new instance of something. So we're going to import that from up1 directory into Ethereum campaign, like so. And then finally, inside of our getInitialProps function, we can remove that console log and we can replace it with a call to this campaign function. So I'm going to say const campaign equals campaign, and we're going to pass in props.query.address, like so. All right, so that's the campaign. So now all we have to do is ask this campaign for some details about itself. In particular, we probably want to call that function that we just added to it a little bit ago. So back inside of our campaign file directory, you'll recall that we had just added in that getSummary function right here. So this is the function that's going to return all the information about this campaign that we eventually want to show inside of our component. So let's call this thing, and then we can just console log out the value that we get back from the browser and see exactly what it looks like, and just make sure that we're getting back some information about it. So back inside the getInitialProps, we'll write out, how about const summary is await campaign.methods.getSummary.call, like so. And then immediately after that, let's just console log out summary. All right, so once again, let's go back over to our browser. We're going to refresh the page. And then just as before, I'm going to really expect to see this console log in our terminal during the server-side rendering process, as opposed to inside the browser. So I'll go back over. It looks like we've got a little bit of an issue here, so I might have made a little typo. Oh no, you know what, it's just the hot module reload again. We should be able to just refresh this, I think, and it should work okay. Oh, maybe not. So maybe I misspelled something here. Oh, you know what? It is my mistake. We are inside the campaigns directory, so it should have been 2 levels. So ... like so. Yeah, that's definitely my mistake. All right, so let's save this and try again. So I'm going to refresh the page. And after a little bit of a wait here, I actually just restarted my server. That's why it's taking a little bit for it to pop up. But in just a second, there we go. All right, so now I should be able to flip over to my terminal and see the summary object that we got back right here. So here's result, and we got back some information. So notice how the keys of this thing look a little bit interesting. We've got 0, 1, 2, 3, 4, and then we've got the actual values for each of those. So let's talk about exactly what's going on here with this return object that we're looking at in the next video. In the last section, we logged out the summary that we got back from an individual campaign. So this right here is supposed to be the minimum contribution. I think that we've got the number of requests, the number of something else, and then the address of the person who created the original campaign, or essentially the manager. Notice how this object right here has keys of 0, 1, 2, 3, 4. So you might look at this and think that it's kind of like an array of sorts. However, it's not an array. It is in fact an object. Anytime that we call a function from a contract that returns multiple values, we get back this result object right here. And it looks like it is an array, but it is in fact an object. So now that we've got this data back, let's flip back over to our component and we're going to finish off the getInitialProps function. In particular, we want to make sure that we take all those properties that were just returned on the summary object right here and make sure that we return them inside this object. So I'm going to remove the console log. And then you might be thinking, okay, well, let's just pass that entire object in there. But remember, this summary object has these different properties, which mean completely different things. So I think that maybe rather than passing through the entire summary object, we should label every property on here and pass them as individual props down into our component. So in other words, rather than just passing that entire object through, I kind of want to print out the or pass down the specifically minimum contribution property, and like the owner property and the balance and the approver's count and all that kind of stuff. So I want to pass those down as individual props rather than this entire big object. The reason I want to do that inside of getInitialProps right here is that, we've got this object right here and it doesn't very clearly label the purpose of every one of those return values. Like we are seeing right now 0 as minimum contribution. So I kind of want to just kind of process this object right now and label each of these fields, rather than have to deal with it later on inside of the component itself. Okay, so let's label each of these. First off, we have the minimum contribution, and that's going to be coming from the 0 property of that summary object. So even though I just said this is an object and not an array, it's still going to look like we are accessing it as though it were an array. So to get access to that 0 property, we could write summary at 0. And that will give us this first result right here. And then we can repeat that same process for all the other keys on the object as well. Now, I don't personally remember which of these properties right here were which, right? They're all coming up as 0. So we're actually going to have to go back to our contract and look at the order of values that we had returned from it to figure out which of these zeros right here are supposed to be what. So back inside of our contract file, it looks like the second return value is the balance, and then the number of requests, and then the approvers count. So back over here, we'll do the balance is going to be summary at 1. We're going to do requests count will be summary at 2. Approvers count will be summary at 3. And then finally, the last one is a little bit more obvious. This is the address of our manager. So we'll say manager is summary at 4, like so. So again, we're taking care of this kind of translation layer right here in our getInitialProps function so that later on inside the actual component methods, we don't have to say like summary at 0 and remember, oh yeah, this is supposed to be my minimum contribution or anything like that. We're just returning these very well-labeled properties from the getInitialProps function. So when we eventually make use of these inside the component methods, we can just say this.props.balance or this.props.manager, as opposed to having to continue to reference this kind of nasty summary object. All right, I think I've kind of drilled home that point well enough at this point. So let's take a break here. We're going to come back in the next video, and we're going to start getting all these different properties to display really nicely on our campaign show component. We've now read in some details about our campaign, and we're ready to actually print them on the screen as is shown on this mock-up right here. So we need to somehow get these little boxes together, and each box should show one individual metric to our users. Now we've already used a component from Semantic UI React once already that looks an awful lot like these things right here, and that was the card group component. So if I go back over to my Semantic UI documentation, I've already pulled up the docs for the card component, and if I do a search for group, I can go down to the example where we saw the card group component in action. So here it is right here. So we pretty much want to probably put the actual metric, like a value, maybe the address of the owner or the balance of the campaign or whatever it is, here as the bold text. And then maybe the grade text in this case could be the name of the metric, like something that says, hey, here is the address of the manager of this campaign. And then to make sure that our users really understand what these numbers mean, we could probably put a little text description of each individual metric right underneath it. So that'll just educate our users on what the purpose of the manager is, or what the purpose of the number of requests is, or whatever else. So as a quick reminder, to get a card group component to show up, we can make an array of items that will have objects inside of it with a header, description, and meta property. And then we can pass that array to a card.group component as a prop called items, like so. So let's give this a shot. I'm going to flip back over to my code editor. I'm inside of my campaign show component still. And just like we did back on campaign index, let's make a little helper method that will create this card group for us. So down right here, I'm going to make a new method and we'll call it, how about render cards? Because that's pretty much what it does. So inside of here, we're going to make a list of items. Previously, we had iterated over a collection, right? We had the list of all the different campaign addresses, and we mapped over that thing and created a separate item for each one. But this time, we don't have a collection of anything to iterate over. This time, we're doing a very custom card for every individual metric that we want to show on here. So we're not going to do a map this time. We're going to do something much more similar to the documentation that you see over here. We're going to write out this array manually and specify each individual card, its header, its meta, and its description property. All right, so back over here, we're going to make our array of objects. And each of these is going to have a header, a meta, and a description. Now we said that the header should be the actual value or the actual metric that we're trying to report. So we need to now pull all these different properties right here off of our props object, because we eventually want to make an actual item for each of these. So I'm going to do a little bit of destructuring right above this items array. I'm going to pull off each of these different properties that we just passed in to this component. So I'm going to say const balance. I want the, not the owner, the manager, the minimum contribution, the requests count, request count, and approvers count. And we're going to destructure all that from this.props, like so. So now for the first item object right here, we can pass in the header of, say, just manager. So that will get our manager to display really nice and bold on the individual card. And then we could put on a meta description to this thing to really label it for our users. So maybe for the manager, we give this a meta of something like address of manager, and then a description to tell our users exactly what this thing is for. So maybe we give it a description of something like the manager created this campaign and can create requests to withdraw money, like so. So that's just going to educate our users and give them a good idea of, hey, what is the manager for? Now, one real quick thing here, I have not placed in any commas, so I'm going to make sure that I do that right now at the end of the header and meta lines. Now, before we go any further and create any other items, let's create this actual component and get it to display on the screen, just so we can verify that this is going to end up looking pretty much like what we want it to look like, right? So underneath the items array, I'm going to return a card.group, and I'm going to pass in our list of items, like so. Let's not forget to import the card group component at the very top from Semantic UI. So up at the top of my file, I'm going to make sure that I import card from Semantic UI React. And then finally, we need to make sure that we call this render cards function from within our render method. So down inside of our render method, right underneath the H3, I'll call this dot render cards, like so. All right, so let's now test this out in the browser and just make sure that the item right here that we've created already is going to show up the way we expect. So back over here. All right, okay, so we don't have the address just yet. Let's refresh this page and we should definitely see the address appear on the screen. So I'll refresh. And there we go. Okay, so hey, maybe it's not quite perfect just yet. You'll see that the address is very long, so it actually breaks out of our card right here. But we can address that with some styling really quickly. So we're going to add in a little custom style here. This items object takes not only the header, meta, and description properties, but it actually takes one other property as well. And this is an optional property that we've not used before. It takes a property called style. And that can customize how this individual card right here, or the card that is created by this object, gets styled on the screen. So I'm going to make sure that I add a comma at the end of my description over here. So there's my comma. And then I'm going to add on a style property. And we're going to give this a style of overflow wrap break dash word. So that's going to cause that really long address to break into two and wrap down to the line underneath it, so it doesn't kind of escape out of our card. Remember that we could put on that flow property of true and get our card to expand all the way to the right-hand side of the screen. But our mockups specifically show these cards kind of fitting together in a nice style like this. So I really want to just kind of constrain the width of each card. All right, so we've got the style right here. Now do take note, we've got overflow. Flow has a lowercase f and a capital W. So just make sure you get that capitalization correct. And then we'll save this file and see how we're doing. All right, so back over here. Yep, there we go. So now it's nicely kind of wrapping itself down to the line underneath it. All right, so I think this looks pretty darn good. let's take a pause here. We're going to come back in the next video and we're going to create item objects for all of our other properties coming from a campaign as well. We've got our first card placed on the screen. Let's now continue by creating a new card for all of our other properties as well. This is going to be a pretty good amount of typing, but hey, let's just get through it as quickly as possible and we can move on to some other interesting stuff. All right, so I'm going to create a new object here. I think that will make our next card to represent the minimum contribution. So here's my new object to represent that minimum contribution. I'll give it a header of minimum contribution. I'll give it a meta of minimum contribution, and I'll really make sure to indicate that this is in terms of way right here. And then for the description, we'll do you must contribute at least this much way to become a approver. Actually, that'd be an approver, excuse me. Okay, I think that's reasonable. Let's work on our next card. So new object. We'll do a header for request count, meta of number of requests, and then a description of a request tries to withdraw money from the contract. And then we'll kind of display the rules here. We'll tell our users that, hey, requests actually have to be approved. So we'll say requests must be approved by approvers. Then for the next one, we'll do a card for, let's see, what else do we have? We need the approvers count. Let's do that one. So we'll do a header of approvers count. We'll do a meta of about number of approvers. There we go. And a description of number of people who have already donated to this campaign. And then just one more card. I know this is a lot of typing. This is going to be the last one. So the last one we have to do is our balance. Now, one quick thing to keep in mind here is that this balance is going to be in terms of way. So anytime we pull a balance off a contract, it's always reported as way. So we probably want to again use our Web3 library to do a little bit of conversion from way over to Ether. Let's make sure that we've already imported Web3 at the top of this file. So up here, it looks like we've not yet done that. So I'm going to make sure I import Web3. And this time I'm going to make sure I get my path correct. So we want to import Web3 from .. Ethereum Web3, like so. Then we'll go back down to our new card object down here at the bottom. We'll put on a header and we're going to specifically convert our balance over to Ether. So we're going to say web3.utils from way balance, and we'll pass in Ether. Oop. So Ether as the second argument. Then we can do a meta with campaign balance. And in this case, we'll specifically mark this as being Ether, like so. And then we'll do our description of the balance is how much money this campaign has left to spend. And I accidentally did another typo here. I don't know why I always do that, ERE. Yeah, it's just Ether, like so. Okay, so now the moment of truth. Let's save this file and see how we're doing. So I'm going to save it. I'll then flip on over to my browser again. And all right, now that looks pretty sweet, if I do say so myself. So now at one quick glance, all of our users can get a really good idea of the status of our campaign. And not only that, but new users will get a good idea of what each of these individual numbers mean. So I think this looks pretty darn good. But of course, having a campaign balance of 0, 0 approvers, and all this kind of zeros on the screen right here is kind of boring. So let's take a pause here. We're going to come back in the next video, and we're going to make sure that people have the ability to contribute to the campaign so we can start turning those zeros into actual values that are a little bit more interesting to look at. So quick break, and we'll tackle this form in the next video. Our list of campaign details is now appearing nicely on the screen, which means we can start to pivot off to the right-hand side of this page, where we want to show a form to our users that allows them to contribute some amount of money to this particular campaign. As I'm thinking about this form right here, I definitely am thinking that we might want to eventually show this form in other places in our application as well. So maybe if a user goes over to view requests to look at a list of all of the active requests, maybe that page should also show this form too, because we essentially want to be always bugging our users and getting them to spend money on our campaigns, right? Like that's the idea here. We want to kind of make it really easy for people to donate to a campaign. So I think that rather than placing all the logic for this component right here directly into our campaign show component that we've already created, I think we should make a separate reusable component whose job is to show this form and then handle the submittal of the form as well. So back inside my code editor, I'm going to find my components directory, and I'm going to make a new file inside there to represent that form. Remember, we're using this components directory to place all of our reusable components that we expect to be making use of multiple times inside of our application. Or if not multiple times, at least place components that we don't want to have display a visitable page to our users. So inside my components directory, I'm going to make a new file, and I'll call this contribute form.js because it's a form for contributing. At the top, we'll place a couple of import statements to get some boilerplate put together. I'll then make my contribute form class that's going to extend our component. I'll place my render method inside there, and I'll leave it as empty for right now. And then I'll do my export default contribute form down at the bottom. All right, let's go look at our mockup one more time, and I want to think a little bit about exactly what this component right here has to do. All right, so I definitely see like a form, of course. We've got an input, we've got a button. We already took care of a form previously in our application on the campaign new component. That component had a spinner show whenever someone submitted the form, and it also called a method on a contract whenever someone submitted the form. I think we're going to end up doing the exact same thing here. So just like that contribute or that new campaign form that we worked on, that had the spinner for the button, and it showed error messages, all that whole 9 yards. I think we need to do all the exact same things around this form as well. So if a user tries to contribute and there's some error thrown during the process, we really want to communicate that to our users. So with that in mind, let's go back over to our code editor, and we'll import a couple of components from Semantic UI. And these are all going to be components that we already used back on the other form that we put together. So I'll import form, input, and message from Semantic UI React. Then inside of our render method, we'll return a new form. Inside of there, we'll place a form.field. So form.field. And this will contain our input and our label. So we'll do a label that says like amount to contribute. And then I'll do an input right underneath that. And I expect to eventually pass this thing a couple of different properties. So I'm going to give myself a little bit of space here. When we previously worked on that campaign new component, so here's the component right here, you'll recall that the input that we placed, so here's the input, it had a label, and we put the label position off to the right-hand side, just to kind of like indicate the units of what this label was for. So I think we should do that exact same thing over here as well. So on the input, I'll give it a label. And I'm going to label this with ether. Now this is a little bit kind of misleading for our users. You'll recall that in just about everywhere else, we've been working in terms of way, right? The minimum contribution is in terms of way, but all of the balance that we've been reporting has always been in ether. So we kind of want to make it really easy for people to spend a lot more money on our campaigns. And a real easy way to do that is to say, oh yeah, enter some amount of ether. So it's a lot easier for our users to put in like just 1 ether as opposed to like 5,000 way, in other words. So we're just making it a little bit easier for our users to spend a little bit more money on our campaigns. We're also going to mark this label position as being on the right-hand side of the input. And when I save, of course, all my code jumps. Hopefully that's not too misleading. All right, and then I think the last thing that we'll do for right now is place our button as well. So I'll put my button down. We'll give it some text of like contribute. And then I'm not going to worry about, well, let's put on the primary property right now, and we'll worry about putting on that spinner in just a little bit too. And of course, we also imported the message component for handling our errors. We'll also take care of that in just a moment too. But let's first get this component to actually show up on the screen so we can make sure that we're going kind of like down the right path here. So I'm going to go back over to the campaign show component because we want to show our form inside this thing. So at the top, I'm going to add an import statement for contribute form. And that's coming from ... components contribute form, like so. All right, now last thing to do is place this inside of our render method. So I'm going to scroll on down. Here we go. And for right now, I'm just going to put it directly underneath our render cards. Okay, so just directly underneath it. That's going to make our form show up underneath the cards while we've been saying distinctly that we want to have this show up to the right-hand side. But we'll take care of that kind of layout issue in just a little bit. For right now, I just want to get this thing on the screen. So we'll place contribute form, like so. All right, so let's see how we're doing. Back over in the browser. Oops, another typo. We made use of the button component, but we never imported it from React Semantic UI. So let's go back over to the contribute form. And at the top, we'll just make sure that we import button as well. I gotta start keeping track of these little buttons, you know? All right. Okay, so I think that's reasonable for right now. Again, we want to have this eventually show up on the right-hand side, but we'll take care of that little detail in a moment. For right now, I think that the label looks good. We've got the label off to the side here, and we've got the contribute button as well. So let's continue working on our form in the next section. In the last section, we got our form to appear on the screen, but it's down here at the bottom, and our mockups definitely show it as appearing off to the right-hand side. So in this section, we're going to figure out how we can use Semantic UI to easily do some layouts of different components on the screen. Back at the documentation, I'm going to find the section for grid right underneath collections. So here's grid right here. We can use grid to lay out some number of elements on the screen in a predetermined fashion. I'm going to scroll down quite a bit here. I'm going to look for the section labeled as column width right here. So if we look back at our mockup right here, we're essentially showing that we want this campaign details thing over here to more or less take up a pretty good amount of space on the screen and then kind of stashed off to the right-hand side in its own little separate column, we want to show that form. So we essentially want to have some different columns on the screen, some of which are wider or take up more width than the others. So we can make use of this code snippet right here to get a good idea of how to do that. So it looks like we're going to import the grid component. We have to place an instance of grid. We'll then make some different columns inside that, and we can pass this width prop to each of those columns to specify the width. Notice that the width is just a hard-coded number in each of these cases. The width is going to total up to some particular value, in this case 16, and it's going to essentially allocate proportions of the available width to these different components inside of here. As usual, this is a good place where writing out the code is going to make a little bit more sense than me trying to use words to explain it. So let's go back over to our code editor. I'm going to flip on over to our campaign show component, because this is where we want to apply these new kind of layout concerns. From our Semantic UI React component, we'll import grid up here at the top. And then I'll go down to my render method, and I'm going to start to work with this grid thing. All right, so here's my render method. So I'm not too concerned about the H3 right here. I definitely want the H3 to be at the top of the page. Underneath that is where I want to start making use of a grid. So I'm going to say grid, and I'm going to make a grid.column. And I'm going to put my render cards call inside that thing. So I'm going to copy this and paste it into grid.column. And then I'll make another grid.column. And I'll put my contribute form inside of that. like so. If I saved this file right now and checked it out inside the browser, I would expect these two columns to have equal width on the screen. But I don't really want the two to have equal width. I really want this render cards to appear to be slightly wider than the contribute form. So I'm going to pass in a prop of width, and I'm going to set it to 10 to the grid.column, the first one right here for my cards. And then for the second one, I'll pass in a width of 6. So the contribute form right here is going to have about 60% of the width of the render cards section. All right, so let's try saving this and see how we're doing. I'll flip back over. And all right, now I've got, my screen here really kind of like constrained, and so it doesn't look too great right now. But if I close my dev tools, we see something like this that looks way more reasonable. So I don't know about you, but I think this looks pretty good right here. I think that we're definitely off to a good start. We've now got our form much more easily visible on the screen, and over time, if we start to add a little bit more labeling to it, it'll definitely be very well placed. So we can have an entire sidebar over here that explains the contract and kind of how it works and what's going on. Let's now take a break. We're going to come back in the next section and continue working on our form.